if you can see us and hear us, please let us know. We would very much like to be aware of that so that we can, do all the stuff we got to do. Hopefully you're all doing well today. Hello, 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 hello. I see someone bringing up tax evasion. That is not what this stream is about. Thank you very much. Hopefully you're all...
Because if so, I am definitely up for the wrong stream.
Hopefully everyone's doing okay. Okay, I see that we're on YouTube, Twitch. If y'all could just... Well, I'm sure we're on Twitch. But
we're doing very well. Hello all! Let's start off with our typical bookkeeping. We have obviously a fun stream lying ahead of us as we dive deep into the dark, mysterious, and magical forests of Athel Loren. But before we do that, we've got a couple of things to say. Number one, as always, if we have super chats, we are going to be bringing up them to screen during the course of our chat. We'll be bringing them up in batches. We won't necessarily be taking them all at once, but we will definitely be taking them all at some point during the course of the stream. We may bring up other comments as well that you drop down just because we like to do that every once in a while, and we are whimsical creatures, much like the spites and the spirits of the Athel Loren itself. So who knows exactly what will come up on the screen beyond that. Beyond that, if you do have anything that you want to say to us, you've got the chat where you can chat to each other or us as we go. Loren, anything you want to open with? I am definitely Compass Mentis right now.
Yeah, just a couple little quick things of that. Hopefully you're all really doing well. If you haven't already, make sure that you just pop by everybody's channels. Andy just finished a absolutely amazing finale to part 3 of The Enemy Within. And it was super exciting. It was genuinely stupid exciting. I was on the edge of my seat and yelling at the screen almost the entire time. But
it was super fun from my side as well because it didn't turn out as I expected.
Yeah, it was a very good time. If you haven't already, it is never too late to start watching LAWhammer, especially because it's actually not super hard to get caught up. But yeah, if you haven't, make sure you check that out. And then for this Wednesday, there will be a stream. We haven't locked down on what it is going to be yet. I've seen some really nice ideas kicked around. So me and Andy will be chatting about that after the stream. But good news for I think most people in chat is that y'all did it again. There was another tie on figuring out what the hell we're doing for Lorebeards. So while this week we're doing Athel Loren, there will not be a vote this week because next week we're going to do Takala, the denied one, which is going to be pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one a lot. Not just because I always enjoy a little bit of elf fun, and who doesn't like a little bit of Slaanesh fun? But because it's a character that doesn't have an enormous chunk of lore. And as we've discussed in some of our previous streams, that doesn't necessarily mean we don't have a lot to say. So that's going to be super, super fun for us to dive into. But today we're going in a very different direction, for we're heading towards Athel Loren, the realm of the Wood Elves.
Yeah, so without further ado, I believe we are good to get kicked off.
Yeah, okay, so I'll begin, because you know that I love to have a little jaunt through history to get us going with any of these streams. So before we dive into our first batch of super chats, let's have a little discussion as to where the hell Athel Loren came from in the first place. Now, for those of you who know your Warhammer, we're aware that there have been many editions of the battle game. It started with first, that moved up to about 3rd edition, where the Warhammer world, as we understand it, began to form properly, and then moved from 4th, where it came in hard, up to 8th edition. And we also have the old world on the battle game side. Where on the fantasy roleplay game side, we have 1st edition all the way through to 4th edition, each of which had a slightly different take, much like the battle games. Athel Loren, though, it first popped up not as Athel Loren. Well, it did. So let's dive into that just a little. All the way back in the late 80s, there was a need for Warhammer to have a place to have all of its fights. So we got ourselves the old world and the Warhammer world in general, where they took all of the various historical models that were available out there, all the fantasy models that Citadel Miniatures were making, plus everything else, and just went, yep, let's drop them all down into one giant world. And for our Tolkien Wood Elves, which we all know, and in many respects, the token Wood Elves that were added to the setting, we got ourselves multiple locations. One of the largest of which was the Loren Forest. Not Athel Loren, the Loren Forest. Now, it was sited over at the far, far, far right of what is now very well known as Britannia, their equivalent of France. It's also worth noting that Britannia at this point was not the Britannia we knew today of chivalry and knights. It was much more pre-revolutionary France. It had quite a different tone at this point. And the Loren Forest was also completely different to what it would later become. Our first Loren Forest is just a big forest. That's it. Just a big forest over at the far east of Britannia, sitting in the shadow of mountains on 3 of its sides. In terms of its very first lore, one of the best places to go to if you want to get an idea of what it's like is go find yourself a first edition copy of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. In there, you will find the demi-humans of the old world. Back when elves were demi-humans and dwarves were demi-humans. And they have a discussion about the Loren Forest. And the Loren Forest is pretty much summed up with just a few pithy sentences, which is, yeah, this is where most of the Wood Elves come from. Yay! That's pretty much about it. And Athel Loren is mentioned for the first time because Athel Loren is the capital. It's the biggest city of Wood Elves in the old world, where the king and the queen of the woods, and that means the king and the queen of all Wood Elves across the old world, were sited. Now, back then, because Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1's population numbers were super weird, they were not really based in any great historical document, and they were often based on some very odd sources, but they said it was an enormous, huge city of Wood Elves, Athel Loren, and it had about 1,000. Which both contradicts the whole concept of an enormous and huge, and also the idea of this is the biggest city of Wood Elves in the old world, then surely they're going to die out pretty goddamn soon because there's just not all that many of them in the world. But at this point, Athel Loren is just a city. The Loren Forest is one of the many, and I do mean many, Wood Elf realms that you would find in the old world. Another one of the large Wood Elf realms would be the Loren. The Loren, which at this point is a part of the same woodland, let's say, kingdom, with the king, queen of the wood down in Athel Loren ruling them. And that is what we would have for almost 10 years. There wasn't going to be much of a change. But as we've discussed in previous episodes, Warhammer changed a lot with the dawning of the 4th edition of the battle game. So in the 4th edition of the battle game, Warhammer Fantasy 1st edition, Fantasy Roleplay 1 1st edition, is still in print, it's still going away, and out comes the battle game going, we are rewriting everything in Warhammer to match what we need for the battle game. Now, for those of you who were around at the time, this was controversial. And I don't just mean slightly controversial. This was very controversial because every single last part of the Warhammer world was rewritten in a way that contradicted the fantasy roleplay side of affairs. The Wood Elves would eventually become part of this, but it would not happen immediately because the Wood Elves were never the most popular of armies. And they got released right at the very, very, very end of the first tenure of Warhammer Fantasy Battles 4th edition. So right to the very end in 1996, as I recall. And I remember when that book came out. By this point, everybody was fully expecting the Wood Elves to be completely rewritten because they had already done it with every other previous book that had been released up to that point. The Empire had been completely changed. Ulthuan had become just one big Atlantis island. The High Elves were completely Dark Elves. Oh my goodness, they've been updated a lot. And we were all sort of both expectant and dreading what was going to come with the Wood Elves. What were they going to do to the Loren Forest? How were things going to change? And by this point, there was already guesses because the Loren Forest had already been marked as Athel Loren in more than one place, which for those who were fans of the setting already went, wait, is the whole thing a city now? Is all of it a city? WTF? What's going on here? As it turned out, no, it wasn't one gigantic city. Instead, Athel Loren was just the new name for the Wood Elf realm, which was now contained within and was just Athel Loren. When the Wood Elf Army List came out, they changed, again, everything that everyone understood for Wood Elves. And there's a few things to note here, because we're not really going to be discussing Wood Elves in this stream. We're going to be discussing Athel Loren itself. So we're not going to be sitting there diving into the history of various Wood Elves and what they did. That's not what really this stream is about. It's about Athel Loren itself, where it came from, what it became, and how it's organized these days. And they changed Athel Loren a lot. The biggest thing they did was they said, you know that big wood elf forest that you've all known about for a good 15 years now? It's a big magical forest. Well, we kind of hinted at that in a few places, but when I say magical, I mean really magical. And Athel Loren doesn't mean the city that's in the Forest of Loren. It actually means the forest from the dawn of the world. They re-pitch Athel Loren as a magical, and I do mean deeply magical wood that is filled with living trees and spirits and a whole host of oddities that are a bit different. And they upgrade the entirety of Athel Loren for the first time, adding proper detail. And the detail that they added in this army list is quite unlike what we'll come to know and learn in later editions. Here, they went, Athel Loren is split up into a variety of, and they named them quickly, glades. And each one of these glades was centered around one of the primary types of tree that they imagined might be in Athel Loren. So you had a beech glade and a pine glade, and the great oak of ages, which was at the center, was surrounded by oaks because it was the oak glade. And as you go around all the various parts of Athel Loren at this point, it's given a pretty pants map in this book. The pants map is split up into various glades, and they use those glades to give each one of the areas a tone. And to put it very simply, said, and the wood elves moved into this forest, and each one picked up traits from wherever they lived. So if you came from the ash glade, you were like Ashwood elves. Yeah, man, that'll do. Yay! And away they created the basic core of the shape of Athel Loren. This is going to change a lot in a later edition, but the core of the history of the wood elves don't. And this is really fascinating because there's two different strands here. The wood elf history pretty much doesn't change at all. It gets added to with later editions, but they don't really update it. Most of the elves that we come to know in the future are mentioned here. Most of the great stories, whether the great ages of the wood elf forest or anything else, are pretty much put in place here. But the actual details of Athel Loren are about to be heftily changed, but not as soon as most people expect. The wood elves, not being the most popular of armies, didn't get a 5th edition army list, but did get a 6th. And in the 6th edition, the place again got an upgrade. Not much. If we move to the 6th edition, for those of you who know your differences between the editions, when the 6th edition of the armies came out, they were somewhat more scant on detail concerning the background. They weren't redolent, because I do love that word, with extra stories and long histories and characters with at least a page or two worth of detail. Instead, here it was a quick intro and a bunch of army list stuff, explaining exactly what the armies were. And they didn't change much of the detail at all. They added to the stories a bit. They added some new special characters that we now know and love. They massaged the background a bit, but they didn't really change it much. And it really isn't until we eventually arrive at the 8th edition of Warhammer that we finally get the Wood Elf Kingdoms as we know them today. And when I say they changed, they really changed. Where beforehand, it was a big, forested, magical realm, which was split up into various glades, and each of the elves that lived in those glades had a slightly different character. And then you had the king and the queen, all the main characters that we know and love from the Wood Elf army list, if you want to go into them. They completely redid the entire forest. Now, for me, this was a pain in the arse, but it was also a good thing. Let me just go grab it. So by this time, here's the special edition of that Wood Elf army list.
Oh, fancy.
Okay, yes, fancy with little gold leaf on the edge of it, and lovely little best. It's a super lovely book. Now, I got this book because my daughter, my eldest daughter, was collecting wood elves at the time, because she loved wood elves and she thought they were ace. So I picked it up, and I was working at this point on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And I was at the point where I was doing maps for them, and I was looking at it going, oh, this is looking very interesting. Let's have a little look through here. It's 2013. I was on the tail end of Fantasy Roleplay, and the Wood Elves have been pretty much established by that point for what they were. The Azrai that we all know, for those of you who want to go into the Wood Elf side. But then this book came out, and its map came out. Grab that book again, and it completely redid the place from the ground up. It took every single one of the various glades that existed before and didn't just replace them, it reboundaried the whole thing with an entirely new map. And instead of presenting them as glades of one tree type, They split it up into eternal realms, 12 eternal realms, in fact. And each one of these realms was pitched with a quick, generally 3 to 4 paragraph description with a lovely ruler laid in there too. And a completely different version of Athel Loren was presented. And I mean completely different. The stories were entirely upgraded. The danger of the place was massively upgraded. It was a little bit like somebody had been listening to hard rock for the last, I don't know, 20 years, and then suddenly went, wait a minute, our volume, or indeed our amp, goes up to 11. Let's put the fucker up to 11. So they did. And they completely ramped up everything. So the discussion we'll be having today is obviously about the newest version of Athel Loren, because that's the one that is the standard setting for all games that are made today. This is the setting that the old world will be riffing on. This is the setting that games like Total War, games like Vermintide, as you move off, and games like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition were using as their base level entry point for Wood Elves. But before I continue and finish with my description of where Athel Loren came from as it is now, it's worth noting that there has been one further development to the setting beyond just what is presented inside the rulebook. Because at the end of the 2010s, I was hired to do Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition. And I was in a bit of a place where I had to rationalize what a Wood Elf was. And that, as it turns out, was a much more complicated question than everybody realized. Because Wood Elves, as they are pitched inside the Wood Elf Army list, are xenophobic isolationists who have absolutely no desire to speak with anyone. Doesn't make for the best PC at all. And we also have officially on the various Warhammer maps a place called the Lorelorn. The Lorelorn, a great Wood Elf forest up to the north of the Empire, to which the Wood Elf Army list claims doesn't exist. The only Wood Elves that exist are in Athel Loren, and that is it. So I had to sit down and make that all work. And I did. The elves of the Lorelorn are a completely different type of Wood Elf. The elves of the Athel Loren are, again, a completely different type of Wood Elf. And there are possibly other elves, old colonies that came from a long, long time ago in other small isolated places in the old world. So you'll find that the background goes back to the very first edition of the game, draws inspiration for there, but takes every edition of the game that comes in between and says they're all true too, and this is how we make it work together in one final big setting. So that brings us up to today. So today we have Athel Loren. Athel Loren is the magical home of, well, many people say it's the magical home of the Wood Elves, but they are, in truth, more recent invaders. The realm of Athel Loren is, in fact, the magical home of great, enormous tree spirits and nature spirits. And the elves came along much later into the whole affair and inveigled their way in, largely because of a great story that we've already covered when we did the stream about Durthu. So do go check that one out, because we go into some depth as to how exactly Athel Loren becomes pretty much the Wood Elf realm rather than just the tree spirit realm. So we've got ourselves a huge magical place which is bound in with magical stones that are holding it in place. We'll get to exactly why pretty soon. A mighty realm of living trees that, if though we were not bound in, would spread out and almost certainly, with all the spirits that are held within them, probably die because they couldn't control themselves, because they are pretty much atavistic base creatures. They are not necessarily known for their intellect. They are wild. They're like animals. And the Wood Elves pretty much tend them like they tend any forest. Think of the Athel Loren nowadays as more like a bonsai tree than a wild forest that you might find out there, in that it has been very carefully curated and very carefully kept in balance by a host of magical effects that the elves put in place, sometimes with the help of the local spirits, sometimes at war with the local spirits, because they don't like it. We have this mighty magical kingdom bound with magic stones on all sides, and it's slowly, at the time when we come towards the end times, collapsing as the end of the world is drawing closer and closer, and the great spirits that once held it all together are slowly dying or corrupting or something similar. And that is what we're going to be discussing today. Athel Loren, its 12 great realms, the various locations you can find within it, and to a smaller degree, the Wood Elves too, because you kind of can't talk about Athel Loren without talking about the Wood Elves. But do be aware that come the modern setting, they are not the only Wood Elves that exist. So throughout the course of this stream, we will probably be referring to Wood Elves, but we don't mean all Wood Elves. We just mean the Azrai. The Azrai are the Wood Elves that live within and sometimes in harmony with and sometimes in conflict with Athel Loren. Consider Athel Loren like it's one ginormous spirit, a little bit like Ewa from over in a completely different setting when we move over to Avatar. The place is living, it's dangerous, and unlike, say, for example, the Avatar version where you live in harmony with it, it'll all be great. Yeah, no, living in harmony with it does not mean it will be great. It just means you're less likely. Yeah. So we'll be going into the details of what the different realms are like, what it's like in the forest itself, and I think that'll do for our intro. What do you think?
I think they'll do great. So we're gonna get caught up on super chat stuff real quick, and then we will go from there because there's a surprising amount to cover with this.
Yeah, there's a lot to do.
Yeah. Despite the fact that it's the Wood Elves, funny enough, they are the most extreme example of if you pick up every single one of their army books and read through them, it's a wild ride.
It is.
But we'll get on that in a little bit. John Schultz, any idea on when a map camera is going to come back? Assume this is for LAWhammer. For this stream, what's your favorite part of the forest?
My map cams, for those of you who don't know, in LAWhammer, we have a camera where occasionally when we play things out, a map can be seen with the map cam. Our map cam wasn't doing the job that it needed to, so we stopped using it. We have just bought a new one, and it's currently in the process of being hooked up. I've got the box for it sitting over there. And I'm hoping it's going to be ready within the next couple of weeks. So I'm hoping it's going to be ready relatively soon. As for that, what's your favorite part of the forest? Oh, that's a toughie ask. I quite like, as we'll discuss later, I quite like Aranok to the north for a variety of reasons. So we can get to that later.
Yeah, I think for me, it's probably Woodrioth. Woodrioth is the Pine Crags. There's a lot of little aspects about it I like. Once again, we'll get into all that later. Like we'll talk about the individual kingdoms.
Yeah, Woodrioth is awesome. Love it.
Yep.
There's something else. Oh, there is one other thing that I should say just while we're here. The Wood Elves draw upon a bizarre mixture of Greek, Scottish, Irish, and Welsh words and pronunciations. And because of that, the amount of different types of potential pronunciations for these words that were going to arrive are varied. So we are almost certainly going to be contradicting each other as we go through as our own individual versions of what we think it should be pronounced that hits the screen. Because Widrioth, for example, I've always called it Widrioth, and Woodrioth, for example, coming from Sotek. We are going to have different ways of pronouncing these things. I strongly suggest go grab yourself a Wood Elf army list and just take a look at it and make your own choices up for those. Yeah,
or take my advice and just default to Andy because he actually thinks about it and I don't. So
I do think about it.
Okay, you're both sadists with the choices, though. Yes, we try. It wouldn't be any fun if they weren't hard. Where do Wood Elves buy their clothes? Athel Loren. Thank you. There's a whole kingdom that's just the super center. Brian, finally caught you guys live. I was wondering if you could get your take on if you could attribute the end times happening to a single character, who would you say is the most responsible for Archaon's successes and eventual victory? And he goes with Bellicor. I mean, I'm going to be that guy. And if you're going with the way Games Workshop decided to do it and the way that they told the story, I would say Lilith is the overall person who screws everything up and is the
I mean, she screws everything up, but I would argue that Bellicor was the one that put it all in place, regardless of whether he wished to at some points or whether he literally spawned Archaon. He pretty much was responsible for the law.
That's a fair take. Within the books
themselves, I think equally, Lilith is not just a fair take.
Within the book themselves, Lilith does a lot of shit. Her and Manfred both got brutally poorly written to make the plot move.
If you asked a different question, which characters would you redo completely from the ground up?
Lilith and Manfred.
Manfred, both of them, because both of them are brilliant potential characters. And by Lilith, I don't necessarily mean Lilith is a great character, because Lilith ends up representing multiple different potential things. Oh, what a mess.
Yep. Bart Key. Oh, well, speaking of Manfred, when Manfred stream, probably not. I mean, I would say there's a very good likely you will see some kind of vampire on the next week's vote, because we won't be touching anything elf or chaos related. So
totally. And we've offered Manfred up before, and it wasn't voted for. So the general answer to when this particular stream is, it's when it gets voted for. We do.
We'll make a coalition.
A nice mixture of different options. Yeah, but the polls are your potential enemy here, Bart.
Yeah, y'all need to start organizing yourselves to influence votes. Can you find coconuts in Athel Loren?
Probably.
As silly as it seems, the answer is yes, because what we'll get into is that Athel Loren is not giving rules to Athel Loren is kind of like trying to pick up a puddle of water without a microscope and claim what all the microscopic organisms are in that puddle of water. You're just not gonna get it. Athel Loren is bonkers.
It's the dawn of all the great woods, so to speak, but it is at one point or another connected to pretty much every great wooded area in the Warhammer world. And even to its later incarnations, and I don't mean in the timeline of the books being published. In the 8th edition, it pretty much says right at the very end of time, before the world just goes boom, even then it's connected to the vast majority of the forests of the world. And that means most of them have come back through. And as we'll discuss, large chunks of Athel Loren are locked in weird times, weird seasons, weird temperatures, weird places. Some of them are quite literally like wandering through a tropical forest or a rainforest or an equivalent. Other parts are locked in eternal winter or eternal summer. Yet, nevertheless, the trees will not just thrive, they thrive at often an extraordinary rate. Even in the darkest, most blighted areas, the trees are still strong and moving on with some capability. So the answer to this is almost certainly yes, because all the forests of the world are connected through to Athel Loren.
I'm gonna
kind of represented there.
This will be one of the rare streams that later, not right now, but later I'm going to bring up an image to demonstrate a point, which is just how ridiculous Athel Loren is as far as like its reach. Because Games Workshop actually made a really cool series of pieces about it, which Total War took and then expanded on to really nice effect. So anyway, Michael Thomas, thanks team. Always great listening while painting. Well, thank you. Hope your painting goes well. Is there a tropical island section of the forest? Not that they explore, but is it there? Yes, and it's almost assuredly within the Summer Kingdom, which we'll talk about.
Yeah, agreed completely. The army books really only focus in on a couple of paragraphs for each one of the core areas of the forest. This forest is truly freaking huge. Don't think of Athel Loren like, say, for example, like the Black Forest over on the edge of Germany. It's much bigger because the Empire and the old world as a whole is much bigger than the real world equivalents already. So this is a truly enormous place, and it's got so many nooks and crannies and special locations and caves and roots and high soaring peaks and weird ass stuff that there's not just some bits that are like that. There'll be multiple varieties of them popping up in different versions, some of which will be like a blighted tropical forest, another part of which might be a proper summer tropical forest that you move through and you feel like, I don't know, you're playing the start of some sort of Kingdom Hearts game on a lovely little beach with palm trees looking down. So yeah, the answer is broadly speaking, and I think just in general, should several of these questions come in, if you are thinking, is there a tree type that could exist here? The answer is yes. And let's also add that there's probably a special version that only Athel Loren has of all of those as well. They don't just have an oak. They have special sky scudding oaks that do special things. They don't just have big redwood equivalents. They have the special Athel Loren redwood that goes to the sky and back. It's a proper crazy place.
Yeah, Laughing God, I do think it was a bit of a missed opportunity of the battle game not to have various magical forests as sub-realms of Athel Loren. Could add sub-factions, playstyles, narrative weight. Yes, very much so. Granted, if you go back to Warhammer Fantasy, they didn't really do sub-factions outside of summer campaign events. And unfortunately, the Wood Elves got left behind in a lot of those. Because you're right, that like Storm of Chaos, it was a genuine shame that the Wood Elves didn't get one of the little bonus factions that they added. For like they did for like the Slayers of Kanak Kadrin or the Cult of Pleasure for the Dark Elves and stuff like that. The Wood Elves really should have gotten something for the Storm of Chaos. But
it would have been lovely if the Laurel Lorn had been tackled, for example. That would have been beautiful.
Yeah, that
They're
being
giving you
said,
something better to work with rather than just having to make it up.
yeah, I would be really shocked if the upcoming Arcane Journal for the Wood Elves does not do this, because all of the Arcane Journals have 3 at least subfactions for each of the races they've been bringing up, and the Wood Elves, Athel Loren is like back and being acknowledged by GW again as a Wood Elf forest. So I suspect the Athel Loren is going to be one of the subfactions, but they may also have some. Like I'm kind of expecting there to probably be like a crazy forest spirit faction, which we'll talk about. That there's a particular kingdom that leans into that. Muffin baskets. Some space frogs planted some wildfire trees, but some invasive species from another region take residence in the trees, upsetting the natural balance of the realm. Thank you. That is definitely the David Attenborough version of the Athel Loren history,
and not entirely wrong.
No, it's really not. Donovan, not really specific with streaming. Something I feel LAWhammer lore could have benefited internally is creating a large spreadsheet with different columns or colors highlighting what is fact, what is accepted, what is probable, what is left to explain. That way, new writers could have known. Oh, yeah, like something in studio. Yeah, that would have been nice, but that would have also required Games Workshop to actually care about like determining all that, and that requires work, which means you have to pay someone to do it, which means that as a company, that's just not what they're interested in. They're here to sell plastic toys.
Yeah, they are. And I do think it's a bit deeper than that. But, oh, pardon me.
Bless you.
Appropriate for an Athel Loren stream. I've been feeling it a little bit today. I'm already dozed up in antihistamines. Very appropriate for an Athel Loren stream. The Warhammer world is there to act as a vehicle for whatever game is being produced. And it merges, changes, twists, and is reused according to the game at hand. This is nowhere more evident than in the various editions of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, where each edition basically rewrote the world. Sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. 8th edition in particular really went to town with completely resculpting what the Warhammer world was like. Athel Loren in particular was remade from the ground up and made an entirely different place to what it was in the previous edition in 6th and the previous edition before that in 4th, and then obviously from what it was before that, where in 3rd, where Athel Loren was actually a city and not a big wooded realm at all. So whilst I completely agree that for people like me, when I'm doing my writing for, say, the fantasy roleplay game, I like making sure that all of the details work and that all of the various versions of the Warhammer world can be represented in the game. That is not something that Games Workshop themselves are particularly interested with. They would much prefer that their authors have got the freedom to use the world as needed for the game or the world at hand. Now, they do have established lore that cannot be contradicted, and we all know what that is. It's the army lists that get produced for the core game of the day. So in the case of, say, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, pardon me, the 8th edition army lists were the core that one would not break. That's where everything starts. And in many respects, everything's written in there. Nice and clear. You can just go through the 8th edition. Literally every novel that exists is considered not to be canon when you are writing to that. The novels are just there as additionals for a completely different set of almost Warhammer universes, because often those novels don't just contradict each other, they contradict the army list, and they contradict tons of other places too. So those novels are seen almost like else worlds. They are things that may or could have happened, and when you move to the game at hand, if you want to draw from those, you can do so as long as the studio approves with it. Well, Games Workshop's licensing approves with it. But when it comes to the actual core setting, they sort of do have what you describe, and that's the army lists. And as the old world gets established, it's very likely that the old world will become a new standard for all it is 250 years before the end of the world. But it will definitely form a new standard, and many things that we have grown used to, Sotek and I in particular, will be sometimes gently rewritten, and in other times rather roughly rewritten as they turn it into something new.
Yeah, and it's not always a bad thing. Like a lot of the times, it's really easy to get caught up in the idea that like, oh wow, I wish Games Workshop like never changed anything, because when they change is bad. It's like, no, it's really not. A lot of the time, it works out just fine. Like it can be jarring, sure, but like just as a very easy, very recent Age of Sigmar example of that, if you go into Age of Sigmar. The Fire Slayers were very deliberately written as a purely patriarchal society that uses really patriarchal names, and that is like a core tenet of them. You have the Rune Fathers, the Rune Sons, and they in it they write really heavy about that. And then as the lore continued to expand it, and Games Workshop they really pigeonholed the Fire Slayers, and they started to realize that as things got older, and they started going, we don't really like that anymore. And they started having more authors come in who started writing about like female characters and stuff, and then they released some minis that had some female Fire Slayers, and they proved really popular. Like people were just buying them and super excited. So now in 4th edition, they literally came out with new lore, the new core book that just completely retconned the Fire Slayers. So they're no longer patriarchal at all. Like they completely retconned it. And it's like, oh, okay, that's a good change. Because it makes just a better story and allows for a lot more stuff. And that happens a lot. So sometimes it's great. I would say most of the time when they change things, it's really not bad. Most of the time it's just kind of different, which people can feel like is bad because change is scary. But
yeah, so just I'll add a small detail there. It's not just this change is scary. If you're someone like, say, for example, me, who is role playing within an existing world, and let's say you've been role playing inside the Warhammer world, playing your own version of the Empire for about the last 5 years, and you really like it, and it's based directly on what's written in the books, and you've got a really good idea of what that world is and a good grasp of how it works. Then a new book comes along, and they, from your perspective, arbitrarily change it. That could be a small arbitrary change, like the town Delberts is moved from the bottom of Middenland into the middle of Middenland. It literally has just teleported halfway through, purely because of the whim of a writer. Or it could be something big, like the Wood Elf realm of Athel Loren has been completely changed. All the glades are gone. All the versions of the Kinbans and the Kidrins and how they work are gone, have been replaced. That can be annoying as fuck, because you've got an established world that you're playing in, and now you've got a decision to make. Do you just ignore the new stuff, much of which might be super cool, or do you just rewrite your entire game around something that you think may change again in 3 years' time? So be aware. I agree entirely with Sotek that generally the changes are for the better, but you are going to find, particularly across the internet, large factions and corners where there is deep antipathy towards any form of change. And it's not necessarily because the changes are bad or they're just changing. And it's not just because it's scary, it's because they've got an established world that they love, and they've been told that established world doesn't exist anymore. And that can be hurtful.
Yeah, which is why you should prescribe to the Andy and Sotek method of dealing with it, which is that you just take it all,
bring it all together,
rush it together, and go, I'll just make it work. Dark Deeds, yeah.
Dark Deeds.
I'm sure.
I'll just say that the Dark Deeds is arriving into the various stock holding positions in the US at the moment. So I imagine early August is going to get shipped. So if you haven't pre-ordered your copy, go pre-order it now.
Good way to support the show. We would really appreciate it. Also, it's going to be a really, really fun game. And yeah. Diamond, really, I thought Kremlazar Gemlo, God, y'all are just playing like charades with that name, was the one responsible. Speaking of Avatar, though, the last Airbender one, how similar is the Oak of Ages to the giant tree at the center of the foggy swamp where all the trees are connected to it? Yes. Yeah. We'll get it. Kinda. Yeah, we'll get into that in a little bit.
I mean, there's definitely similarities there.
Yeah. I mean, granted, a world tree is a super popular trope, and Warhammer has a world tree, which is the Oak of Ages. Jonathan Scott, I was always wish Games Workshop played the horror themes of Athel Loren more than the stereotypical fantasy ones. Give me less Disney, more Predator. We will talk about that. That's actually what Athel Loren is. Yeah, it's not a happy place. It's horrible.
Yeah, so I do think that's worth making clear when we discuss our way through the various realms, because inevitably we're going to get to that. Athel Loren is, yes, in many respects, this classic fantasy elven stereotype of dancing and halls and drinking and merriment and servants providing them with everything that they need. I know, isn't that lovely? And then you go out into the forest. And it really does put the various options that say Tolkien added with Mirkwood and make them look pretty pants.
Yeah, the word, to be frank, Athel Loren is not, like, even for the Wood Elves, it's not safe. It's a horrible.
No. And also, we're going to be probably playing a little bit with one of the stereotypes of Athel Loren that stands up as well. One of the stereotypes of Athel Loren is anyone that goes in there is screwed. I am going to deeply contradict that and explain that if you're playing, say, a fantasy roleplay game, it is a much better setting for role-playing than you might think. But we'll get to that soon.
See, the description of Athel Loren's connection point to all the forest reminds me a lot of library space of Discworld.
So, yeah, to a degree, not an unfair comparison. and the great world routes that span out across the world. And by the way, they really do span out across the world. They do make the Skaven tunnels that spread across the world look almost small by comparison. These great routes that are spread throughout all of the Warhammer world are not entirely dissimilar to that, but it's also worth noting that Athel Loren in and of itself is not that dissimilar to that, as well as a metaphor for those of you out there who know library space. So yeah, there's definitely going to be something to be discussed there.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go ahead and bring this up real quick. Of like, this was the 8th edition version of the World Roots map, which you can see is bonkers. Like, it literally goes everywhere. What
I actually find hilarious about the living world roots part, you could almost hear the game designer going, right, what factions are we using in 8th edition? Right, let's put a yellow line from us to there. Excellent. So if we want to have wood elves facing dark elves, sorted. We want to have wood elves facing off against dwarves, we'll just put it all the way down the dwarven realm, sorted. Orcs, all the primary areas, so that goes right into the Badlands, perfect. Will we make it go over to Cathay? No, we're never doing a Cathayan army, let's fuck that. So basically, it's a pure example of all the areas that Games Workshop cared about at the time, plus a few others for fun, and it just makes me laugh every time I look at it.
Yeah, and what's funny is if you go into Total War Warhammer's Immortal Empires, you can actually see that they deliberately put a lot of the teleporting Wood Elf force you can go to where these lines end up, though they added a few. Obviously, like they added the Grand Cathay forest, which is not on this map, but see, what did GW
would be on a new one.
Hey, we need a Cathay forest. And they were like, all right.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Made a new world route. But there's that for anyone that's curious. It's a real nice thing there. Anywho, so okay, just gonna slam through the rest of these really fast. You might plan to address this further on the stream, but the tree spirits outside of Athel Loren, yes, how common are they? Are there tree spirits outside of Athel Loren? Yes. Is it a weird topic because of the way the book handles it? Also, yes. We'll talk about it in a little bit. What's that box behind you? Any information? Dark D, pre-order it. Links in chat. On a previous stream, said Athel Loren is very important to the world and survival. Why is that? We'll get into that in a second. Also, on a slightly related topic, you said Morgr is a god eater. What gods is he eating aside from Wood Elf gods that are reborn? It's never directly stated. They leave it super ambiguous, so if they want to explore it later, they can. But also, think about how nebulous the term god is. It's a very... Me and Eddie have talked about this so much over many Lorebeards. The term god is very misleading. So Morgr has eaten a lot of things that you could call a god, but different people in the universe would disagree about whether it's a god or not. But it's heavily implied that he's eaten at least a elven god, if not a handful of them. And he's also probably eaten a lot of spirits that are worshipped by humans. And he's probably eaten a lot of things that are worshipped as gods by other various things. That's just what he does. There's no named gods that he's eaten that they deliberately call out.
Yep.
But yeah, so anyway. Fair assessment of the change from 40k perspective. I initially hated the Necron change when they got dynasties, but then I learned about trace and started to really like it. Yeah, that's a great example.
You tend to find that that's often the case with Games Workshop's changes, in that they do a change and often don't develop it frightfully well. It sometimes might be just a couple of paragraphs that are dropped in, and sometimes by a writer that didn't even realize they were making a change. They just dropped a bit of lore that they thought was cool, and they drop that in, and then the next writer comes along, expands upon it, and if it's a not liked bit of lore, often spends more work in it to try and make sure that it's then developed into something that's super cool, and everyone can go, oh, I see why that's there now. So you'll often find that as the various pieces of lore go through iterations, they just get better and better and better as they progress. But it does mean that if you happen to be someone who are playing with an older version, even if you're playing with an older version of, say, a computer game, Malekith, I'm looking at you. If you're looking at an older version of a computer game and things move on, you're left with a little bit of a bitter taste sometimes, going, well, the thing that I love is no longer there. And some people just accept that and they go, you know what, the new thing's better. Other people just find it hard to move on. I've always been of the opinion that there is nothing that Games Workshop can add that probably can't be incorporated into the existing canon with just a small amount of thought. And by canon, I mean the existing, everything that's ever been built for Warhammer, the great canon of work that exists.
The really funny thing about that is Games Workshop themselves only seem to have figured that out in about the last 5 to 10 years. But
they figure it out about every 5 to 10 years, and they go back and then they ignore, and they go back and they ignore.
Yeah, Schultz, are you going to stream a game of Dark Deeds? He should.
Yep, that's going to be happening at some point. We're actually going to be doing an unboxing relatively soon. It's one of the another reason why we need the map cam in place. And I'm fiddling around with it in the background just now to make the stupid thing work.
Yep. Can I get some Athel Loren maple syrup for my pancake? Sure. I mean, we might have to toss you in the Vault of Winter afterwards, which you'll learn about in a little bit, but sure. Maglatroth. Yeah, it turns the lore change. I remember what they did to Catan, which I disagree very much story-wise. Some of the lore changes are good, some not so much. Yeah, and that inevitably happens.
Yeah, inevitably, every single time.
So we're here to talk about Athel Loren. Let's do some talk about Athel Loren. So I'm going to do what I'm going to affectionately call some shock and awe, which is I'm going to slap you all in the face with some facts. And then we're going to kind of break them down and how they're interesting. So, like Andy said, 8th edition was a huge change for Athel Loren. It changed a lot about the forest, where basically they came in and they took it and tried to, because Athel Loren, one of the things that Andy mentioned that you might not have caught is that the Wood Elves had a bit of a funny thing where they skipped an edition pretty much the entire time since they got formed. So they showed up in 4th, and then they skipped 5th. They came back in 6th. They skipped 7th, and they came back in 8th. So their changes were often kind of violent because they had to do a lot of catch-up work compared to a lot of other factions. And in 8th edition, this led to trying to update them to fit with everything that changed since 6th edition, which was a pretty hefty amount of things. So one of the things they did that was massive was not talked about beforehand is that they come in and say, okay, Athel Loren is not just a magical forest, it is the magical forest. And it was created by the Old Ones, which kind of comes out of left field of that. The Old Ones came in and they basically did everything, is what 8th edition really leans really heavily into, is that, they created all of the notable races that you know and love, unless they're like the primordial races or the chaos races. And they also created a lot of the systems that you know and love. And Athel Loren is one of those, where the book basically just says that the Old Ones came down, they planted the beginnings of the forest, and nobody knows why, nobody knows what the point of it was, and then they just kind of peaced out. Now, what the book does do, once again, this is good when they do this, is it deliberately throws in a mystery of it is genuinely unknown and only speculated about where the spirits of Athel Loren came from. Whether the Old Ones intended for them to be created, if the elf gods created them, or if they just kind of naturally came from the world itself.
That's actually almost an ongoing part of the story, because that was also mentioned back in the 6th edition version as well. But it didn't really mention the Old One creation there. That was the 8th edition massive, mighty Old Ones do everything, boom! That was added to the setting. But originally it was much more nobody knows why it is what it is. And then it turned into the Old Ones made it, but nobody knows why it became what it became. Although it's very easy to extrapolate didn't the Old Ones do it?
Yeah.
What?
It's
maybe the elf gods did it. No, but the elves wouldn't arrive for literally thousands of years. That makes no sense at all. Why would the elf gods be responsible?
Yeah, so that another really fun thing is that they actually give us a vague ballpark date for Athel Loren, and it is old. Like, it is way older than anything except for the Lizardmen, where the Athel Loren is ballparked around 10,000 years before Sigmar, which, for the record, the Cataclysm only happens 5,600 years before Sigmar. So Athel Loren was chilling for almost 5,000 years without being bothered, which is a long fucking time.
It is also worth noting, though, that the lore sort of contradicts itself around this area, because it does leave with a nobody knows where the spirits came from, sort of, ooh, how did this arrive type idea, where it says that, and it says maybe it was this, maybe it was that, and then quite clearly states that the spirits were speaking with the elves before the Cataclysm, which means we have a pretty clear answer as to exactly how they came about. But the lore very clearly states equally, but nobody knows.
Yeah, so to kind of speed run us through pre-Cataclysm, because we want to kind of get more into like modern Athel Loren, which has a lot of fun details. Athel Loren is initially created around the Oak of Ages, which is this big super tree that is... The Oak of Ages is a really weird thing because Games Workshop, I don't think they deliberately did this. They more accidentally did it, but I actually really like it. it is not clear if the Oak of Ages is simply just a really crazy magical tree, if it's a spirit in and of itself to the point that it's a god that just doesn't really say or do a whole lot, doesn't really have an identity to itself, or if it is a gateway. Because the thing that's really fascinating about the Oak of Ages is that it literally is simultaneously kind of in its own version of the ether and in the material plane simultaneously.
Yeah.
Which is weird because it's not in the ether necessarily. It's in its like own version of the ether, which is something we probably need to talk about a little bit, which is called the weave. And the weave is a really complicated topic.
And before we dive into any of that, it's also worth noting that this is not actually that new. And by that, I mean, most of the various factions, not all, I'd say maybe about half, have got some version of an area inside the ether that you can access. A part which is not the realm of chaos or the divine realms or any equivalent. It's an extra dimensional space that sort of lies in between. And some of them are really obvious. And you go, oh, yeah, I suppose that does exist. Why didn't I think about that before? I'll give a very clean example. The Light College in the Empire. It doesn't exist in material space. It exists outside material space. Mm-hmm. That is a not generally well considered fact, but it's true. The various other areas are often squirreled away. Like, for example, in the undead parts of the lore, you find out that many of the spirits lie in an area of the ether that lies between the mortal realms and the great divine realms of spirits. They don't really get picked up by, say, Mor, the god of death, and taken on to the next step. They're lying somewhere else, and many vampires can only see that part. They can only see the shadowy lands that lie beyond. Others can see into that at will. Other necromancers can will themselves to see it. And if you go over to the fantasy roleplay side, there's a host of spells that allow you to see into many different parts of not the ether, but other spiritual realms. So be aware that the weave is not something that stands out as unique and weird. In fact, it is a common part of the Warhammer world, and that is that there are parts of the aether that you can enter as a material creature. So that's part of the magical side of things. You can move in, and it feels like, if you're there, pretty much the material realm. But because it's not really in the material realm, it completely warps space and sometimes time. And as we'll discuss, particularly with Athel Loren, time is warped again and again and again, to the point of, if it was somehow controllable, the Wood Elves would be indestructible because they could just go, there's an army coming. Okay, let's train up for 2,000 years and then come out. Because time itself runs very, very oddly in Athel Loren. So yes, there is a host of places like this, but the weave is a special one.
Yeah, so the weave is a concept that, fun fact, if you want to know the most about it, you may go like, oh, I wonder where the best place is. Is it a book? And I say, no, it's actually the game Vermintide. If you go and you look at all the dialogue logs for Carillion, she explains a lot about the weave. Vermintide has so much lore in it that so few people have actually listened to because they're too busy trying not to die horribly, which, fair. But, I also do not like to get my exposition dumps when I'm being sworn by 30 Skaven trying to butt stab me. But the thing about the weave is the best way to explain it is it's kind of the trope of a balanced system that moderates between life and death in the Warhammer world, where it influences the seasons, it influences the laws of nature, and it's the natural world. Now, what's interesting, and this is something that's not explicitly stated, but is more of a theory that I have because of the way that it's organized, is that the weave really comes off like, if we think about how the geomantic web is a system for the lizardmen that taps into almost like shifting tectonic plates, magma, the power of the planet itself from a very geological, almost astronomical perspective. The weave is a very similar system. The old ones seem to have manipulated and put into place. But instead of drawing its power from the shifting of the earth, it draws its power from life on the planet.
I would say perhaps because of how it's often pitched, because of the way the gods are pitched, it appears to be, and again, we're both delving somewhat into theory hammer here because it's not really laid out.
It's not, yeah. It's not
it appears to be mostly the non-sentient life. Although it is also attached to and directly linked with all life. But it appears to be much less linked to, say, Heish, the white wind of magic, which is intellect, than it is Gyron, the magic of life, and Shyish, which is the magic of death. Making sure that we don't just go, oh, it's all about life, is it? No. Shyish is a part of the natural process. And it very much appears to be directly linked to that, and in turn, the world roots, allowing everything to link together into one great system. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, it's that, whole circle of life concept from Lion King, but Warhammerified up. And it allows for a really fascinating exploration of that. One of the things that helps why the weave is really fun to think about, and it helps the Wood Elves really maintain as they are guardians in a very specific way, where they try to maintain this balance. But what makes it fun, and what makes it not just like, oh, they're tree hippies, is that they have to balance between life and death, not just protect life for the sake of life. They're not Nurgle, which is life boundless without control and like a cancerous, just like blah, 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 all over the place. Instead, it's about cutting away the unhealthy bits, about getting rid of the diseased aspects of life, trying to maintain a much more balanced and holistic approach. Like Andy said earlier, it's more like a bonsai tree as opposed to just wild, expanding growth. Which helps the Wood Elf story so much, and Athel Loren's story of that you're dealing with this really complicated organism, as like organism in the sense of like a large group of systems that are keeping an overall system alive, being Athel Loren, of that it has to maintain between life and death and can't lean too heavy one way or the other. And when it's in balance, it's really, really powerful. The weave can be used by certain characters within the setting to unleash some pretty crazy shit. If the weave is like well in balance, Ariel is quite frankly one of the strongest characters in the setting. But keeping it in balance is borderline impossible because it naturally goes out of balance with the seasons, where in winter, death rises up as the predominant force. And in summer, life blows up as the predominant force. And so there's this really complex system that it's a mixture of the cycle of life, but not...
I would say it's almost the magical personification of the cycle of life. So what it does is it takes everything that is alive in the Warhammer world, and it basically draws power from it. And that power, in terms, is almost stored in the great battery that is Athel Loren. Athel Loren lies at the very heart of it, and the great oaks that lie down in there. And the weave itself is largely the power behind the world roots. And the world roots are, bluntly, tunnels through the aether that one can just access pretty much at will. And tunnels that, as far as the spirits of the world are concerned, particularly the spirits of Athel Loren, that are deeply important to the survival of the world itself. And should these roots entirely recede, then the world itself will die. They're intrinsically linked with each other. It's not just that the weave will ensure they exist, or by their existence, the weave can now exist. One is very much in sympathy with the other, which is why during the introduction I said that as we head towards the end times, the world itself is dying. And one of the reasons that the world itself is dying is because the world roots themselves are recoiling, have been cut off, have been infiltrated. And a part and a reason for that goes right back to the story of Durthu, because Durthu is ultimately responsible for the first taint of the world roots. But we discussed that in another stream. Go check that one out after this one.
So, with that out of the way, the Oak of Ages, which its influence expands over Athel Loren, and not just through the world roots, but like the physical space of it as well, where Athel Loren, like kind of Andy said earlier, you don't just have to go into the world roots to experience space and time warping. Just going into the forest itself, under the trees or into the meadows where Athel Loren holds sway, things get weird. It's basically the realm of chaos, and just with a very heavy nature theme.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And by that, what we mean is it's an area saturated with magic. The primary types of magic here might be different to the primary types that are weeping from the gates to both poles. But it's nevertheless a place of extraordinary magic. And this was established very firmly throughout the course of its setting, but nailed into place in the 8th edition, where they pretty much said, the old ones made a special place, yo, and this special place means this. And the descriptions of what you'd had in previous settings were where, for example, if you wander into the wood, you might come out the next day or 200 years later. It's possible that someone might wander into the wood and experience 200 years and then come out the same age, having gone through that wood for the last 200 years. Time is strange in Athel Loren, and it's also strange for the wood elves themselves. Don't think that the wood elves wander through this place in complete control of it. They don't. They've got established paths that they take. They've got routes that they know are safe. They know how not to get lost. They are fully aware that anyone in Athel Loren, to a degree, stands outside of time, as we will almost certainly discuss as we go through some of the various realms. Some of them are relatively famous for their very, 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 very long parties. And humans may be in attendance with these parties, and they are in attendance for the entire freaking thing. And when I say long, I mean a century may pass in a particular celebration. And they are cavorting and lost in it for that entire time until eventually they come to the end and they're led off somewhere else. And it's worth noting that this is something the elves have grown used to, are a part of, but also don't really control. There are ways to make your way through it safely, but they are not in control. Athel Loren is.
Yeah. So, just a very brief history of Athel Loren, because the history is kind of the least important part for, I think, what we're going to be covering a lot in this stream, is that Athel Loren, so the Oak of Ages, Athel Loren goes around it, and Athel Loren expands like crazy. Like, it takes over basically the entirety of what we now know as Bretonnia. It starts crawling its way up the Grey Mountains. It heads down into like towards Astalia. It's going up into the wasteland. Like, it's everywhere. It's a giant.
I don't just think of this as a forest. They are literally traveling, moving trees.
Yeah, and it's not just trees. Some of them are meadows. Some of them are different kinds of like plains, Great Plains, and all these other kind of weird places. It's not. Don't just think like, oh, European forest. It's every kind of like habitat you can consider that fosters life. And so it expands, and it's doing great. Life's going well. We get some fun notes when they updated the Zotes about how the Zotes were the earliest tenders of Athel Loren that we know of, that they were put in place by the old ones to watch after the forest, kind of like how the Slann were put in place to watch after the geomantic web.
But it wasn't the old ones that were responsible for what happened, honest.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No. They may have started it, and they may have hired the gardeners, but they had nothing to do with
nothing to do with what happened there.
Yeah. So they do all that nonsense, and then the cataclysm happens. And Athel Loren, like everybody, struggles. Where the forest it shrinks and it grows, shrinks, it grows, shrinks, it grows. And by the time the cataclysm kind of ends, if you go check out our Durthu stream, Durthu comes back, and Athel Loren is kind of where it's a little smaller than it is today.
Bigger in several places. Because when the elves first get there, it's in a receding position. I've been receding for some time. But it was also coming out, which they found receding.
Durthu was like, wow, it's really tiny now, but it's still massive. It was most of the space. Like, if you just look at the Grey Mountains and then the vaults, pretty much that entire space was Athel Loren by this point. And Durthu comes back and learns that Athel Loren had, as not just the spirits, but the entire forest had evolved to combat the demons of chaos, and was kind of winning by that point. There, at the very least, was at a stalemate. But it talks about that when Durthu gets to the forest, was expanding again. It was pushing the demons back. But Athel Loren had started.
Just to make sure we definitely reinforce that point. The spirits before were not what they had become. Beforehand, the spirits of the forest were living at one with the forest and were not at all, let's say, war aspected. They were not fighters. They did not have the, let's say, propensity for killing. that the Dryads would come to develop with some significant capability. They were changed by chaos, and they were changed in what the elves consider, because it's very much an elven perspective, for the worst. But change is generally perceived in this case to be bad, almost like everyone's a small c conservative, and anything that's seen as development is a bad thing. There's a strong hint of that all the way through the Wood Elf literature in general, because it often harks back to Tolkien and the idea that the old ways are the better, for example. And it very much is the case for Athel Loren, where the old spirits were living at one and they were absolutely lovely. But when chaos came, everything changed. And this place became much darker as an overall place, far closer to the horrific side than the happy-go-lucky, fantasy, spirity side, where our average spirit over there is not called a happy spirit, it's called a spite.
Yeah, and another thing that's really interesting that's worth pointing out is Athel Loren, a lot of people get easily and understandably confused by the Wood Elf roster, where they look at it and go, okay, so all the spirits are like treemen, dryads, and like the little spite thing. So they're all like trees. No, not at all. Athel Loren is full of spirits of all sorts of different kinds. There are naiads, which are the spirits of the lakes and the rivers.
I have a small thing to say in that.
Yeah,
I got told I couldn't add naiads to the game back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. So we're talking all the way back in about 2006. I wrote an article adding naiads as spirits that Wood Elves could use. And I got told you can't do that by Games Workshop themselves because they don't exist inside the Warhammer world. All you have is dryads. So I came back at them with a general, this is why I chose to put them in and why they should be there. And I am convinced this fits in with the existing lore. And this is why. And then I got a nice reply back saying, you know what, we'll go with it, but we're not going to put it in with the Wood Elf stuff. We'll make that be something that's happened outside Athel Loren. Then the 8th edition of the Army List came along, and it's on the freaking map. And I was like, oh, yes.
Yeah, naiads are deliberately name-dropped as really important in 3 separate kingdoms of the 12, which is bonkers. So they're like super important. So you got naiads all over the place, and then you've got a lot. And
Kelpies are mentioned. They're a Scottish spirit, and they're dropped right down in the book. I was utterly bewildered. But they're brilliant.
Pretty much, if you know of like an elemental spirit that exists in some form of mythology or pop culture, it probably exists in Athel Loren. Yeah. Spirits of the rock and earth and water and trees and all that stuff. They're there. They're there hanging out, doing the spirits of wind, spirits of sun, spirits of literally any element you could throw at the wall. It's somewhere in Athel Loren.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that these are not your kindly spirits that sit waiting in a tree or a river or a brook or some equivalent for you to come along and say something nice and for them to come out and go, I'm a spirit, ooh. They are spirits of nature. And as spirits of nature, like the Azrai, the Wood Elves themselves, they sit pretty much in the middle of the balance, which means that some might be good, some are definitely not. Some might be extremists on either side of the great. However you wish to put your axis, there is no real good or evil here. There's basically nature, and nature is horrendously destructive in all of its forms, and Athel Loren represents this. Many of the spirits are pure destruction. They are pure horror show. Some of them are truly awful, and that's a core component of what Athel Loren is. And it's also something that represents how chaos has changed it, where beforehand it was a bunch of spirits that were, gently speaking, neutral. They were very much protecting their own, but they didn't have evil thoughts or dark thoughts or destructive thoughts. With the coming of chaos, that changed completely. But it didn't just change deep down into the we're now pure destructions. It also hyped right up into the no, we need to help. Because the spirits ended up changing not just one way, but in all ways. Because as we know, chaos doesn't just go in one direction. And the spirits themselves changed in all directions. So Athel Loren is anything. Well, it's inconsistent.
Yeah, which makes it even more fun, and also makes a lot of sense. So basically, it remains that way. It expands a bit, leading into as the world expands, the elves initially discover Athel Loren, and the first elves that go in there do not have a great time, and the elves learn to stay away from it. Because it is not friendly to outsiders or blooded life. Like it tolerates things that it considers part of its own natural balance, but in the beginning, it has no tolerance for dwarves and no tolerance for elves or men.
It's actually hilarious. We've got a lovely little bit, I think, in the 6th one where they describe the elves first arriving there. So this is post the Cataclysm, and it's a good 1,000 or so, 1,500 years after the Cataclysm. And they arrive and they're like, holy shitballs, what's this thing? This is fascinating. Holy crap. Wow, look at this. Magical trees. Whoa. Ooh, let's investigate. Because elves are, by their nature, kind of scientists, excited. Magic is totally over the top. It's mental. Let's have a little wander in. After 3 attempts to go into the place, they went, fuck this. We are bounding the whole thing in magical stones. This cannot grow any further. What the fuck is this? Literally one expedition just vanishes. Another one of the expeditions goes in and then comes out, having been in there for 200 years. Another one goes in and a single elf returns completely battered and torn, doesn't die from his wounds, but instead dies of the nightmares the following night of everything that it had witnessed. And Athel Loren is terrifying. And at this point, it goes, elves, fuck yeah.
Yeah, and that's where the waystones come from. Not the waystones, the binding stones.
The great big, well, they're still waystones in terms of what they are.
True, yeah.
Totes.
Yeah, so there's this big old ring of stones on the outside that make up what are known as the Wild Heath, which is the land that kind of exists between Athel Loren and what we now know as Bretonnia, that these stones are responsible for keeping Athel Loren contained. And originally, it was to protect the elves from Athel Loren, which is kind of hilarious. It was the elven colonists going, that thing's fucking out to get us. It needs to stay there. And the elves, to their credit, did a really good job with it. They are masters at designing that kind of thing and keeping the magic of Athel Loren from expanding outwards. Though what they didn't know, which is really cool at this point, is that Athel Loren had already, in a way, infected the entire planet, where the world roots. So this is to answer a super chat someone did earlier, where the world roots popped up all over the world. There is not a single continent that does not have world roots that have punched through it, and they used to be everywhere. Now there's significantly less. But wherever these world roots would punch up, the spirits of Athel Loren. So this is a thing in 8th edition that I don't particularly like, but I'm going to describe it, and Andy will probably add some stuff that will explain some things about the good and the bad and what he thinks about it. Which is that the 8th edition claims that outside of Athel Loren, there are no forest spirits. They don't exist. All forest spirits come from Athel Loren. And that what happened was that in ancient times, the world roots would grow and entangle themselves into the forest elsewhere in the world and basically kind of infect it in a way. And the forest spirits would travel through the world roots to these new forests, and they would just decide to live there. And that one of the lines that it said, which is actually kind of haunting and sad, and I like it as a line, but there are just some elements that I have issues with, which is that the forest spirits went to all the different forests in the world and tried to wake up the trees, only to learn that all the trees had no thought, had no voice, and would never awaken, no matter how hard they tried. So the forest spirits of Athel Loren were truly alone. And that they would travel other places. So it would explain, Athel Loren doesn't have any forest spirits. They're just forest spirits that traveled from Athel Loren and decided they liked Athel Loren so much that they took up residence, that being our Durthu. And the same thing for all the forests in the world, which is deeply contradicted by everything that came before 8th edition and does kind of cause some issues.
Yeah, and it also sort of almost half contradicts some of the other existing lore in the other army lists. So broadly, I think the easiest answer here is that Athel Loren is proper ancient. And if we're looking for a birth point for the great spirits, then it's very easy to say they are seeded here. And then the world roots spread out. And then they pop up in a variety of different places around the world. And as the roots recede in some places, they have left populations of spirits around the world that will allow everything to exist as it currently does. So you can kind of marry the two without too much difficulty. We, for example, know that over in the good old High Elf realms, we've got Avalorn, and Avalorn in its first edition was basically Athel Loren Mark II. It's basically exactly the same thing, and to try and suggest that Athel Loren was unique is pushing it a bit, given that there are multiple places where the writers, when they've described their areas, have gone, no, this is the same. So, yeah, there's, I'd say, some massaging that's needed here, and I also broadly agree that trying to pretend that there is now only spirits of the wood and similar in Athel Loren is just ignoring the wider world of Warhammer, where there are spirits freaking everywhere. right down to just fire spites running around the fire college, where there's literal spirits. They are spirits of fire, and these are spites that also exist in a variety of different ways down in Athel Loren. Athel Loren is not the sole place of spirits in the Warhammer world. Now, you could argue that it is definitely a starting point, and indeed, you could argue a pretty conclusive build for that if you wish to do so, because everything starts somewhere in Warhammer, and generally the answer for where does it start is the old ones. So I think clearly seeding it here, having the roots spill out, and then having them pop up all over the place like little flowers, and then as the wars become, many of those recede, that makes sense. And it kind of makes the whole thing go.
Yeah, I'm totally cool with the idea that it's like, oh, when the world roots initially contacted a forest, they wake it up. Especially because one of the things that is kind of extra like about it was that you could argue that, oh, well, the book's not saying there's no spirits, it's just that the trees are awake. Like the trees themselves, not even like that they're dryads, the tree men, which a lot of people think are actually trees, and they're not. They're actual spirits that just kind of like their war aspect just looks kind of like a tree. But like the trees of Athel Loren, like the actual woods themselves are alive and thinking, and like they can move and do all sorts
of weird tree way.
In a really weird tree way. So, kind of like think about how like if you watch the Two Towers, the extended edition, there's the whole part where the forest starts moving around and it goes after and it like shows up behind the Uruk-hai and they all run in and get massacred. That's kind of what Athel Loren's like. But even if you go with that explanation, that still conflicts with a lot of information about how there are many types of trees in the Warhammer world that come alive. The 8th edition Big Red Book has a terrain table where you would roll for mysterious terrain, and one of the options you could get is a blood forest. And a blood forest is literally a forest that if somebody casts magic, it wakes up because it was asleep and just starts massacring everybody inside of it, and then it moves 6 inches. So it's like, okay, so 8th edition itself is like, no, there's more. So that part of the book, I'm like, I take that with a grain of salt and massage it because it doesn't really match with everything else.
Yeah, I agree completely. I don't just agree completely. I strongly reinforce that completely because the Warhammer world has been written as a far more magically aware place than some books would suggest. But it is worth noting, just to finish off with our bound stones that the elves put in place. These exist right through to the modern day, and right up to the modern day, the Athel Loren is fighting against these wards as they attempt to push out. And sometimes when we're in high summer, they break free and the trees themselves come spilling out. We're not talking about dryads or tree men. It's the trees as they spill out, and the elves will come swooping in and start reinforcing the spells that they've got in place to try and push it back, because they're quite convinced that if Athel Loren spreads out too far, it will thin it, for want of a better description. And as it thins, it will become less powerful, or if you want, healthy. They don't think that Athel Loren can easily move beyond its boundaries as it currently exists. As I say, they like to trim their bonsai, and they keep their bonsai very firmly in one shape because that allows the balance of the weave to stay in place. They do not want to see it be disturbed by the weave being spread and potentially weakened through that spreading, particularly when, as we'll discuss as we go through some of the kingdoms, different parts of Athel Loren are already deeply in danger.
Yeah, and there's also this element that Athel Loren as an organism does not think overall. Yeah. Like Andy talked about earlier, it's more like an animal where it just kind of does. It does what its natural inclinations are, which are to spread, proliferate. But the elves are very clever and political entities that realize that if the Athel Loren were allowed to expand as it wished, it would invite conflict, where the Bretonnians would defend themselves and would be trying to burn the forest down and chop it down, and the Lady of the Lake would probably take action against it. The dwarfs would, defend their mountain holes. And the dwarves have a very unfortunate history with Athel Loren as well. But it would invite challenge. And the elves know that would be bad because it would you would literally have all these different factions being drawn to it either out of self-defense or because they're going up against a perceived worthy opponent in some other faction's cases. So the forest has to be contained for its own safety, even though the forest itself doesn't necessarily recognize that. So it keeps pushing against it.
And not only does the forest not recognize it, many of the spirits that inhabit the forest don't recognize it. They think they are being constrained by the elves. They are being controlled by the elves. And the answer to that is They are. Indeed, in many respects, what used to be the balancing point, what used to be the tenders would be being, say, originally the Zotes or the spirits that came up, the tree men and the dryads, but many of them are no longer doing that job. The wood elves have, in many cases, just replaced them, and they are now doing that job instead. And that leaves many of the spirits deeply, deeply upset. Parts of Athel Loren are at constant war, where the spirits are at war with the elves that reside within
an entire kingdom is literally just a prison.
Yeah, totally. For the very worst and the wildest of spirits. So again, it's worth reiterating, Athel Loren is not a safe wood elf kingdom where all the wood elves live in a happy, joy, tree hugger land. They do not. Athel Loren is a place in a state of constant war. It's also worth noting that large parts of it are infiltrated by things that are not wood elves or spirits. There are war herds that move through Athel Loren, and yes, they sometimes get massacred, and yes, sometimes they don't, particularly given that one of the kingdoms, as we'll go on to, has, let's just call it large, what came from God-eating problems. And I do mean large. And this place is not safe. But beyond that, it's also huge and far too big for it to be entirely patrolled. The general idea is if you wander into Athel Loren, there'll be wood elves pointed at you literally immediately, pointing bows, about to kill you. Spirits, no. Often, and I do mean often, the tales of Athel Loren are people wandering in, passing through, and coming out the other side, because there are many safe routes. There are many places you can go into and never meet a soul, never even meet a spirit. It is enormous. It is enormously dangerous, but it is not this great monolithic place that cannot be approached. It is a place that many expeditions have gone into and several have come out of. It's not as powerful as it once used to be when the elves first arrived. And when they first arrived, it was scary as fuck. And there was more spirits in that place than you can shake a stick at. But as the wood elves themselves eventually found out, many of those spirits were dying, they were getting weaker, and they themselves tried to protect the place. It's a huge place and a place that is just rampant with potential adventure.
Yeah, and the other thing is that at the Loren itself, like the overall forest, is that it is used to having a lot of blooded life of squirrels and stags, and boars and beasts. And if someone passes through the forest and doesn't really make a lot of fuss, like they're not chopping down trees and stuff, it just identifies them as like another creature. They just wander through without an issue. Though, like Andy said earlier, time and space do not work the same in Athel Loren, because you could walk to the forest and pop out, like you could cross hundreds of miles in an hour, or you could spend 1,000 years in there and you're in the same goddamn glade that you started off in.
Absolutely. The glades themselves move, the trees shift. Nothing is certain unless you know how it all works. Now, if you're a wood elf that has lived there for your entire existence, you know the safe paths. There are paths through Athel Loren that are safe. Some of them are fixed in particular places, and in many respects, you can almost see why the wood elves wouldn't like the trees to expand outwards, because that changes the nature of where the various, let's call them factions of trees, reside. Their entire paths will split, change, shape, and reshape into something that the wood elves will no longer understand. It's not entirely an altruistic, we'll save the world thing. It's an altruistic, we're saving ourselves thing. Because without control, this place will go wild, properly wild, because it already kind of is. So whilst there are many safe paths, and many a knight, a questing knight, has passed through one of the safe paths, if you go through one of the core open paths that go from glade to glade, you are probably, assuming you don't piss anyone off, and assuming the wood elves don't kill you, going to be safe. You can pass through these areas, but many of the spirits are not necessarily going to be kind. Some might seduce you, some might try to kill you, others might just be curious and come up to you and try to figure out what you are. Some will appear like animals, some will appear like the elements themselves, whether it's rock or air or water. Each of them will have their own individual ways of interacting you. I think the other thing I'll say on Athel Loren before we get caught up with the other bits is it's also not just inconsistent with time and not necessarily as dangerous as people say, but also much more dangerous. It's also a place where The seasons themselves are not fixed, and the very nature of night and day is not fixed. You can walk for days in twilight. You can walk for days in night. And that's because certain parts of the forest are stuck in particular seasons, in particular time periods, meaning that going through Athel Loren is almost always weird. But there is this consistent, if you want to know what to expect, most of the time it's twilight, in that the canopy comes over and everyone can sort of see. But you don't see the stars above. You don't see the sun and you don't see the moon because the canopy completely covers it. When you're going through Athel Loren, you don't know what time it is. Everything ceases to make any great deal of sense until you hit one of the open glades. And when you hit the open glade, you can look up and it might be night, it might be day. You can't be certain what you'll get. And you might arrive in one and see that winter is raging up above when you've just been passing through a sunlit land just yesterday. It's a very odd, magical place.
Yeah. The last example I'll give on that before I probably won't touch on that point again is that the most extreme example I've seen, which is a fantastic story, is about a Bretonian knight who literally runs into himself. And it's not a fake version. It's not a spirit. Yeah. It's actually him. So he's a questing knight and he runs into the Grail Knight version of himself. Because the Grail Knight version of himself is trying to stop a particular event from happening in the past. And the Wood Elves tell him that if he travels the forest, theoretically, he could make it to a certain point in time to stop something bad from happening in the past. So he's just constantly running around the forest trying to prevent a certain event from happening. And that's his entire story. And like the opening of the story is that he shows up at the beginning of the story, the Grail Knight version from the future shows up to stop a bad event and he's too late. It's already happened. He goes, damn it. And then he rides off again. And you're like, what the fuck by the end of the book? It's really fun. But yeah, it's a weird place. Okay, we're gonna get caught up on Super Chat stuff, then we're gonna start talking about kingdoms. Do you think some plan from Athel Loren could be used to make an elf pyre better as opposed to magic mumbo jumbo? Do you mean like
empire?
Like empire? He means like elf empire?
That seems to be the case.
Yeah, Hammond, I'm not sure what you're asking on that one.
If you're still there, Hammond, just write it down. I'm watching the comments just in case you drop it in again.
Yeah. Do you think the forest spirits would prefer the elves use non-organic materials to build such a stone and brick? What elves don't build? Silly. Elves? They tree sing. They gently massage and convince the trees to grow in particular ways that allow them to use them as buildings. But all of their structures are living. Or they're like natural cave systems and things like they do carve like the mountains. Like if you go to the Pine Crags, there are certain rock formations and stuff that they'll carve and do things with. But like the elves do not destroy or heavily alter using tools like living things, because that would very much cause a defense response, which would probably kill them.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background there, Durthu originally taught what is now called the High Elves, I suppose, but they were just elves. Durthu, way back in the day over in Avalorn, before the Cataclysm, taught them tree singing to show the inhabitants of Avalorn, including the Everqueen, how to bring the life that they were surrounded by into order with their life, so that the lives could coexist and commingle without damaging either side. In fact, not just not damaging, but actually reinforcing each side. A little bit like our own bodies are covered with various mites and creatures and tiny little things that are entirely responsible for our bodies working at all. So the elves were seen as these tiny little things that are working within the great entity that was the forest, reshaping it and purging it of anything that might damage the forest, while they themselves lived within it. And that included the stone, that included the earth, all of which could be shifted and shaped using magic. Durthu then obviously does all of the things that Durthu does. And when the elves eventually, much, much later, come into Athel Loren, the very first mages that strike through to the very heart of the Oak of Ages, they're re-taught how to tree sing again, because this is long after Durthu did the original teaching.
Audit who comes over and is like, this is
way after. And the elves, having been given sanctuary inside Athel Loren by the spirits, because the great war of the beard was raging outside, and the dwarves were not friendly to the forest, and the forest was not friendly to the dwarves at all. The elves were brought in, they were given sanctuary, and they were taught to exist and coexist with the forest at this point. And that was all from the spirits of the forest that taught them, with Durthu being the primary proponent of making the elves be a part of their new existence. So, yeah, that's a good way of bringing it all into place.
One of the lores of magic that we've lost in Warhammer is the lore of Athel Loren, which used to be its own standalone lore in the 6th edition book, but in 8th edition, they were just like, the elves just know all the Wood Elves just know all 8 lores, and they know high and dark magic, because, woohoo, which was cool.
Elves!
And then they gave them a single tree singing spell as an item. So they still had the lore of Athel Loren, but only as the one spell. One of the things that I hope we get in the roleplay game when they, there's been like some pretty reliable things that they want to go into Athel Loren at some point with the big book. One of the things that I really hope is to get the lore of Athel Loren back, because what the lore really suggests that I think is really, really cool is that the lore of Athel Loren probably in its entirety would be sung. It would not be a spoken lore, it would be a singing lore. Much like if you actually read a lot of the lore stuff, the lore of high magic, or light magic tends to be sung as well.
And much amber magic is chants as well, rather than the classic spell, you know, as they're ho, 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 as they chant them out. So yeah, different types of magic are expressed in different ways. And the lore of Athel Loren, for want of a better description, is almost certainly wood singing and weaving the nature of the weave around them in a fashion that they can coexist with and potentially turn it into a weapon, because it is, after all, Warhammer, not Treehammer.
Yeah. Athel Loren's place that Malachi turns into a timber yard in Total War Warhammer 3. I really enjoy your content. My favorite part of the weekend you guys brought. But yes, I really appreciate that. And yeah, I got a pretty good hoot out of the dwarf landmark building of the Oak of Ages, the lumber yard. Fucking dwarfs. Tanako, thank you very much for dropping in to listen about the home of my favorite eco-terrorist elves. Yep. Don Man, so the weave is what gives nature its power. It's kind of a symbiotic relationship. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the Warhammer world together. So the elves have a high midichlorian count. I see what you're doing there.
And you know what? You're not entirely wrong by that. And by that, I mean that the elves are magically completely different to the other species. They are more in tune with spirits. And as we all know, on the other side, demons. After all, they are all bound to being eaten by Slaanesh. Yeah, elves are different. Don't try and make elves, you know, just pointy-eared humans who happen to live in forest. They're just not. They're an entirely different species. And they are much more, as the rulebooks often describe it, magically sensitive, but it's much deeper in terms of what it actually means for them than that alone.
Yeah. Say what you want about the old ones and their creations. They did not Control-C, Control-V. Their various species. They built them all pretty different from the ground up. It may not seem like it, but they genuinely did. Yeah, so I'll say this. Actually, I'll wait till the end of the super chats, but I've got a bit of a crackpot personal theory, which I'll talk about.
Oh, I love crackpot theories. You know, I love one of those.
Yeah, to plan. Does the season work like in reality? In that case, it's never all winter. The upper hemisphere is the opposite season. The equator part is mostly fine. Shouldn't that balance the weed? Northern hemisphere, rider bias. So when you're in Athel, you know, it is kind of a Northern Hemisphere writer bias. You're not wrong, funny enough. Though I think you could actually do some fun exploration there of one of the reasons that the Oak of Ages might have, like, there might be something in the Southern Hemisphere somewhere in the world that's more than just a world route, but is much more significant because of that needing to maintain balance. Aspect of the weave, maybe like down in Lustria or down in the Southlands. You could play around with that actually in a really fun way. I never thought about that.
So, just without getting lost in this as a potential subject, because this could
that could be a big can of worms if we tried.
I would generally say that the overall season of the old world, as the old world moves from its cycle, spring through to summer, through to I am from the UK, autumn, and then down into winter and back to spring again, is the general cycle for Athel Loren. And that general cycle is replicated in the cycle of the rulers, the king and the queen, and the seasons that they represent, and the cycle and breathing of the forest itself. But large parts of the forest do not adhere to this. Large parts of the forest are perhaps stuck in eternal winter or eternal summer or eternal autumn or eternal, you get the idea. There are many ways that we can easily attribute this to that makes sense within the world. For example, if you've got a part of the forest that is always stuck in winter, there is nothing at all saying that you couldn't have the world routes that connect through to that part of the forest being cycling, if you will, through the seasons of the world. As the winter, the winter part of it is always connected through to that part of the forest, and it's manifesting through there, and it reaches up to the canopy but doesn't pass the canopy, because as we know, the canopy is almost where the magic doesn't so much come to an end, because the canopy is big, but the canopy is almost the defining point between what lies beyond and the actual experience season and what lies within, inside Athel Loren. So I think there is an easy way that we can justify how the seasons work within it, and that would rely upon the seasons not just of the northern hemisphere, but the southern hemisphere and potentially different parts of the world too.
Diamond, given the variety of plants in Athel Loren, it's a shame we didn't get more variety in war aspects. Tree spirits, you can have grass-based ones with like whip attacks or things with poison thorns and spikes. Yeah, that's just a limitation of the minis.
Limitation of minis.
Yeah, literally pretty much any description you ever get about like a unit of dryads, each dryad is different, like wildly different. Tree men would all be wildly different. It's literally just a limitation of the tabletop medium, but don't mistake that for like, oh, that's what it's like.
I mean, one of the issues that we had when we were doing back in second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, when we were talking to those who were dealing with making the decisions as to what could and couldn't be in the game, was attempting to show that dryads were not just the war aspect, because all the minis were, and going to the description saying this is what they should be majority of the time. The majority of the time, they're not crazy bark covered war aspected creatures. They're instead these spirits to do these things. And there was significant resistance from Games Workshop from that, not because that wasn't the case, but because ultimately they're the company that is selling the miniatures that they own. And they don't sell pretty little girly dryad models. They sell war aspected models. So there was always a pressure to push towards situations where you would be representing miniatures rather than representing what the text said, which was, I always found a difficult thing to accept because I am grumpy by nature and like things to be like what they're described. But nevertheless, I understood that. It just meant that you had to be a little bit more canny with how you're presenting things.
Yeah. Athel Loren, Catachan if you took levels in Druid. I mean, if you want to get technical, yes, Lustria is more like your true Catachan in that it's a literal death jungle, but there are parts of Athel Loren that are literally just Catachan. The Wildwood is like, it is death. If you go in there, if you go into the Wildwood, which we'll get into the individual kingdoms in a moment, the best case scenario of you leaving is that a forest spirit gets you, scoops you out, and wears you like a fucking costume and walks out of the Wildwood. That is the best case scenario for your body, but there's no way you're going to make it out of there.
Yeah, the Wildwood's a fun one.
Let's see. Are there dinosaurs in Athel Loren? If I can't have my X-Knight Dragon Knights in 40k, I will force them into fantasy. What up on a Carnosaur, baby? Are there dinosaurs in Athel Loren? Yeah, probably.
Probably. The description of Athel Loren doesn't include that. But it doesn't include a lot of things. It would almost certainly be in Athel Loren.
Yeah, I would say this would be a case of like GW wouldn't want to conflate their army ranges. So if someone wanted to bring that up, GW would say, no, don't do that, because that's a lizardman.
That's exactly what would happen. Because you don't want to mix your Wood Elf army with your Lizardman army. So thus, if you were building it yourself for your own games at home, I don't think there would be any problems with you doing so. But you would get some purists out there who go, what the frick are you doing? Where did they come from? That's Lizardman stuff. That should be in the Southlands or over in Lustria or something. Not forgetting often that it's a big world with lots of different types of creatures all over the place.
Yeah, remember what we said, though.
Yes, but.
Yeah, remember what we said, that parts of Athel Loren are stuck in time. Like you would find a glade that is stuck 10,000 years ago. Like that would be a very realistic thing to run into. Nils, are there elemental spirits in Athel Loren related to the elemental spirits in Araby, like Jins? There would be, yes, but they would probably express differently because spirits often express based on their environment. So desert spirits are going to appear very different from what you would expect from forest spirits.
Yeah, if you take a look at the crazy ship that they made for Dreadfleet, it actually had a mixture of almost traditional style elemental forces. And those elemental forces absolutely are present within Athel Loren. But Athel Loren has a distinct and almost discrete flavor, where the vast majority of its spirits are nature related. And nature related generally doesn't mean an element of pure fire, for example, unless you happen to have a volcano and the spirit that lived within it. And there's not very many volcanoes
Yeah.
right, sitting in the heart of Athel Loren. So you tend to find that the tone of the spirits there would be quite different to the tone of, they say, the Jinn or anything similar that you might get elsewhere. But pretty much all parts of the Warhammer world, no matter where you go these days, has got some form of existing local spirit. Whether these spirits are ones that have been manipulated and used by gods or sorcerers or whatever else, they are pretty much there.
Yep. Do you have any idea how places with different seasons, just where the seasons interact with the weave? Places with different seasons, such as where they have seasons like Southeast Asia. Yeah, so we kind of covered that earlier, where the world roots, there would be a if it's not expressly stated, but it would be reasonable to assume that the world roots and where the world roots connect into the forest of Athel Loren itself would have a correlation to where the world root branches emerges elsewhere in the world, where likely where it emerges would have an influence back into Athel Loren itself.
Absolutely. If you take a look at the world route map, which was shown earlier in the stream, do not think of that as a fine example of what the world routes look like, and think of it instead as a snapshot in time. It's what the world routes look like when they're out there in one way, but they're shifting, they're moving, they're connecting into different places. There are rituals that the elves do to try and shift them and make them regrow in different directions as well as they sing them down into different parts of the world. So moving through the world routes and where the world routes connect to is not consistent. And in turn, I think that that's not just because it's weird and magic, man. It's because there is legitimate things that the world routes are doing. They are connecting Athel Loren through to other parts of the world for reasons. And one of those reasons, an easy one, would be to help the weave incorporate the different seasons from different parts of the world and bring them back to and allow them to be embraced by Athel Loren.
Yeah, there's some miserable bastard that's gone into Athel Loren and he walked into like the typhoon season part of Athel Loren, which just gets drenched. Bart, can Orion travel to each hideout of the forest? Does he have to pass everywhere? Is considered a special one for the forest? No. Even Orion is a guest in a sense. Even Ariel, the Queen of the Wood, there are parts of Athel Loren that resist her, that fight against her, which we'll talk about a little bit. But yeah, no, they are the king and queen, the gods of the elves, and much of the forest respects them, but they are still, as far as the overall organism of Athel Loren is concerned, they're still microorganisms. Yeah. It doesn't, they're too insignificant a lot of the time. Think about like how actually, I don't know if that's a great example, but like there are things in your body that are very important to your overall system, but to you as an entity, don't, like, you never think about it and you don't really care about it. And it has a place and it needs to do its job. Even Orion and Ariel fall under that.
I agree completely. In fact, using the body as an analogy is a great way to try and imagine it. Athel Loren is you. You are an organism that is constructed of billions of other organisms. Indeed, there's even relatively strong evidence nowadays that some of our organs were originally other organisms that we absorbed at one part, way back in our evolutionary tree, so to speak. And that we are a combination of multiple organisms, many of which we cannot live with if they die, and many of which we don't need. The gut biomes within our stomach, for example, they are more likely to define our mood than what happens around us sometimes. Your gut biome is extremely important. And in a similar fashion, where the elves are moving around inside your body is going to be determining which parts of your body are more or less healthy. And you could argue that the spirits that are in there are not necessarily all working towards your, let's say, better position. For example, there are a host of biological organisms within you that if they get out from, say, your stomach into another part of you, they will kill that part. And they will cause horrendous damage over there and potentially kill parts of your body. And yeah, it's one gigantic organism with lots of things living within it. And the elves, you can argue, have become the new version of the immunity system. And it's a new version because there's an older immunity system in there already that is wilder and much more prone to just killing anything that comes close to it, where the elves are a little bit more precise in what they attack.
Yeah. Cyber UK, well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much. First time I've caught you guys live. I always watch your videos after. Just want to mention you guys are awesome. Such a great team. Been watching Sotek since he started. Wow. That's a long time. But follow you both now. Best team on YouTube.
You're old man, Sotek.
I've been on here longer than I care to think about. For Sigmar, how has the extreme environment affected the Azerai morality / worldview, and are they still very prideful as most elves are? Would a wood elf meeting a high elf / dark elf be a major culture shock? Okay, so fun fact is that if you take quite literally any elf from a major place and stick them in a room with another elf from a major place, there will be culture shock. It doesn't even have to be like a different species of elf. Like if you take a high elf from Ulthuan and slap him in a room from a quote sea elf from Marienburg, which is just a high elf. There would be a huge culture shock. Just like if you take a Loren elf and stick him in a room with an Athel Loren elf, there's going to be huge culture shock, even though they're technically the same kind. And all elves think they're the best elves. Like that's just elves.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, generally speaking, most elves think they've got it right, regardless of what their individual views are. And the army lists sometimes actually reinforce this by saying that elves uniquely of all the species of the Warhammer world are immune to mutation, which is going to be super fun when we move to our topic next week, because Dakala is an elf who is mutated. Elves are immune to mutation. They cannot mutate, but they are still influenced by chaos. And when they're influenced by chaos, it tends to be mental mutation. It tends to be their minds move in different directions to what they should do. And they give the general idea that each of the different types of elf have all been mutated by chaos into different directions. And typically pride is one of the core components of that. And with the wood elves in particular, they are horrendously isolationist. In general, they do not like other people at all, including other elves. They are filled with pride that they're the ones that are responsible for keeping the world's engine in place. The great weave of life that exists only exists because of them. Lizard men are nothing in comparison to the wood elves. Dark elves are just stupid. And high elves, what the fuck are they even doing anyway? They are very much of the opinion that they're better than anyone else, including their peers. And there's a significant amount of antipathy just between wood elves. Some wood elves just wander out to the forest and never want to meet anyone else ever again because fuck them all. They're a lovely people, the Azerai.
Yeah, there's a quite a fun bit about like a lot of the war dancers among the wood elves and a lot of the way watchers, not the friendliest folk. Even to like other wood elves in that same culture don't get along. They're a nasty sort.
Yeah.
What happened to the Zotes? Did the elves kill them? No, they're still around. There's just very few.
Just isolationist. They're much like the elves themselves. It seems that Athel Loren, by its very nature, breeds a certain desire for isolationism and separating yourself from everyone else. The spirits prefer this. That was their preferred beginning, and Durthu was the one that broke that. The elves that moved in have preferred this, and the Zotes themselves also prefer it. So it's not that the Zotes are gone or they're wiped out. It's just there's so very few of them, and they are by their nature isolationists doing their job without the need of anyone else.
Yeah, there's a fun little note in the Zote entry in the Storm of Magic how when an elf, notably an Azerai, wants to like truly master the Wind of Gyran, they'll try and track a Zote down, and it's like it's hard because the Zotes don't like to be bothered.
Yeah,
they got work to do. They're busy.
Busy guys.
Yeah. So the elves use magic to shift metal ore into weapons, tools, armors. There are smithies within Athel Loren, which we're going to talk about. Warhammer Kingdom is very strong around that. Metal is inorganic. There are implications they could influence it, maybe, but it would be very subtle. Whereas if you need to make a weapon, that is not subtle. That requires.
Yeah, for the wood elves in general don't go for the whole mining thing. They're much more into the using magic to get hold of what they need, working within nature to take what they need from what's available. And nature also works with them. Don't forget that this is not like the real world. If they are in great need of a particular thing, there is ways to get that thing that involves speaking to the local spirits, working with the trees, bringing it up to the surface in a way that a human or a dwarf never could. They don't take the direct route. Let's go down with a big hole, open up everything that's down below, and take everything out of the earth and, in classic terrible language, rape the earth. That is not the wood elf way, or indeed the elf way of doing it. Even the dark elves, to a degree, have got better methods of doing these things. For all they do, absolutely take everything from around them.
They can be bothered.
And have massive minds. But the wood elves, they don't really need the whole mining thing, but they are nevertheless, they are in command of a great deal of smithing and metal work. Indeed, metal work from the elves, and particularly the wood elves, are some of the finest that the world has to offer, and they are universally known for it. So yeah, definitely out there.
Yeah, and it would be so think like elves do use industry in a sense. Like the wood elves do use industry. They're smiths, but the way they receive all of their materials is going to be very, very different than what you would expect from a mundane race.
We had a discussion about this actually when we were writing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, because I removed miner as an option, for example, from wood elves. And there was a discussion directly with there was a discussion where they said, so how does it work? And there was a loose bantering of emails to make sure that everything was pinned down in a way that we liked. And the opinion at that point was, I will make spell singers later, the various spell singers that you've got with your high weavers, your dark weavers, and all the rest of them, for the wood elves, that will effectively open up a host of other careers that allow you to be an artisan, allow you to be a crafter, but also allow the wood elves to have their own unique version of doing all of this stuff that doesn't require them to use the miner career, because they don't have miners. And Games Workshop were like, yep, definitely, that's the way we go forward.
You can just imagine that you would see a spell singer or a spell weaver or a tree singer literally singing to the trees, and the roots literally digging down deep and grabbing all these pieces of ore and just bring them up to the surface for the elves to use, them making relationships with the spirits to get what they need. It's a symbiotic relationship.
It's actually quite fascinating, because for all many people view Warhammer as a far more low magical setting in comparison to some others, because they look at the grim darkness of, say, the Empire, and then they compare that with, say, some of the more fantastical elements of, say, Tolkien, and they go, well, that's far higher magic, and the Empire is far. It's like, no, the Warhammer world is really, really very different in different parts of it, and as a setting, it is extremely, extremely high fantasy. If you wish to term things in such a fantasy and in such a way in places like Athel Loren, but in general, it skips up and down depending where you are.
Yeah, one thing I've always wanted to know is how wood elves actually lived within Athel Loren. They're big archaeological population concentration. They live semi-nomadic bands foraging across the countryside. Can they practice agriculture? Do they sustain themselves on hunting? So the first part, both. It depends on the kingdom. There are some kingdoms that have like genuine cities. There are some that are just fully nomadic. It depends on where you are in Athel Loren, because they live in harmony with their environment. So like if you're up in the Pine Crags where there's these big mountains and like really a lot of rock and hard trees and stuff, they have made fortresses out of these big mountains and elegantly carved them where if you were to walk into the Pine Crags, you might not even realize you're walking past a giant fortress because it's so naturally part of the environment. There are other places where the elves live way up in the trees because they live among big arboreal spaces, and they use tree singing to make bridges across them, and the trees grow so that they have natural rooms and halls within them. There are some places where like they talk to the spirits of the river, and the river spirits flow in such a way as to carve out the rock and the mud and the environment so that it makes to a natural amphitheater type structure. Like they work with what they have around them, which is what makes Athel Loren really fucking awesome. And allows it to be extremely diverse. And as for sustaining themselves, the forest often provides, but it comes at a cost. Hunting is allowed, but the elves are often expected to give back to the forest when it's appropriate. So, like when an elf dies, it's very normal for the wood elf's corpse to be given to the forest for the forest to feed upon, as the elves fed upon the creatures of the forest before. Or they might take like berries and things like that, but you must give something back in return.
Loosely speaking, the elves live in harmony, I suppose would be one way of putting it.
Less of a kumbaya harmony and more of like a I bleed you, you bleed me harmony.
And their shaping of the environment is not a destruction and replacement shaping. For example, I am going to wipe out this glade and turn it into a farm. Instead, it's cultivating the existing fruits, the existing animals. It's taking with care from the existing stocks. They live in harmony. It's part of one big ecosystem that they're a part of. But they don't really farm. And as Sotek, I think, absolutely and accurately puts it, their cities, such as they are, come in so many different ways. Some of them that hark back almost to the cities of the High Elves in terms of how they appear. Others that are far more classic wood elf. I mean, even the largest of them down by the Kingsglade, it's literally impossible to see if you were to walk right through it. All the oaks around you, you can't see it because it's so well integrated into not just up, but down, because it goes down into the roots, and the roots themselves part and move and create large spaces underneath the ground. There's this general belief amongst many that wood elves go up. It's not the case. Wood elves go up, down, left, right. They're everywhere. They're underground, they're overground, they're wombling free. They're everywhere.
How do you like Vermintide 2's view of Athel Loren? I mean, Vermintide's been pretty accurate in a lot of the ways it portrays a lot of things. Athel Loren barely gets any time in Vermintide, unfortunately, because we're much further up. But there are a few scenes you can get with Carillion, like when you go into like I can't remember if it's Warhammer on Vermintide 1 or 2, but when you're in the Wizard's Tower, there's a particular enchantment that he casts that like casts you to where like some memory of yours, and Carillion's inserted to Athel Loren. And it's a really, really cool scene. But because I think they go to like Athel Tamara. No, it's not Athel Tamara. There is a forest they go to, but it's not Athel Loren. But yeah, I think it's pretty good. Generally, the Vermintide team tries really hard, and it shows.
I love Vermintide's team. I've spoken to them quite a few times when I was running things over at Fantasy Roleplay, because we did our starter set in Ubersreich, which is obviously where Vermintide was set. So we were constantly passing things between us as to what we would like to see. And originally, when I was sorting out the pitches for the Enemy Within versions we were doing, 3 of their characters were going to be popping up in various parts of the Enemy Within as well. We're going to be seeing, well, obviously Carillion. In fact, we're going to be seeing several of them. And that was going to be a super fun part of that, but that obviously didn't happen because I moved on. But yeah, fun. I love them.
Necromancer Cobalt, you say there are more spirits than you can shake a stick at. I'm pretty sure the spirits are the one shaking sticks at you. Yeah, you're not wrong. Ravon, I've been researching the Cataclysm of the Elves because I want during that time period. But the Elves around the time, no tree singing. Yes.
The Elves of Athel Loren, no tree singing, definitely, and very likely some of the other forests close to and around that area too. If you're working through the Cataclysm in the early parts of that, their literal gods are there as well. It's not just the great spirits like Durthu that are kicking around.
Watch our last week.
So the answer to that is broadly yes.
Yeah. Durthu was, or Oakheart, as he was known by the elves, was well established by that point. First time, long time. I want to say the series has brought me many hours of joy entertainment. You're both great storytellers. Hey, thank you so much. To Blom, I'd like the Southern Hemisphere Oak of Age to be a submarine forest with giant seaweed kelp intended by fishermen. Y'all will just never let it go. That being said, a piece of the Oak of Ages coming up in an underwater forest is, I would say, not at all that extreme, and is a really cool idea that you could absolutely explore. And that there's probably a great lake somewhere within the Athel Loren that has a great underwater forest in it, which is cool. Sean Souls, do the Lizardmen have knowledge of the forest? Yes. But like the Slun know about Athel Loren. It's part of the great plan. But they don't talk about it very much. There's actually a really cheeky quote in the Storm of Magic relating to the Zotes, where it comes off like the author of the Storm of Magic was a reporter, because it talks about how the Slann were asked about their opinions on the Zotes and refused to comment. And you're like, what? But
that's random. So I think, Sean, in general, the question is actually slightly more deeper and fascinating, and speaks to the Lizardmen as a monolithic block, which I think probably is not the best way to think of them. The Slann as a whole are living in an almost entirely different realm of existence to the rest of us. Are they aware of a big magical forest on the other side of the world? Yeah, it's just part of the world that they themselves are aware of as they're working their way from place to place. But do the Lizardmen know? No.
Oh yeah, no.
Which is worth making clear, because it's sometimes very easy to go, does such and such know about this? And then you realize you're actually only speaking about maybe 5, 6, 10, 15 characters in the world. And when you say Lizardmen, it sounds like you're incorporating the entire race. And yes, the Slann, definitely. But when we're talking, and not all, because some of them will have literally nothing to do with whatever crazy part of the plan they're working on. But the Slann as a whole, yes. Could that be communicated between them? Absolutely. But the Lizardmen, no.
Yeah, probably not at all.
No.
They're eagles and hawks, so yes, dinosaurs are in Athel Loren.
Good point. Like it, Dino Man. Very good point.
I'm sure that's totally what that person meant when they asked that question. When does Orion come into the picture when it comes to Athel Loren? For the sake of this stream, he frankly just doesn't matter. But he showed up after the War of Vengeance. With him and Ariel both showed up as the colonial elves moved into Athel Loren after they declared independence from the Phoenix Throne. Colby Carrion, will we ever see Spites on the battlefield till war, maybe a swarm unit? Could you? Yes. Will you? I don't know. It just depends on if they want to do another What Elf DLC, and if that ends up being something they want to do. I will not. Swarm units come with a lot of challenges. Nurglings were like a really impressive feat by Total War, because it was the first time they really pulled off a swarm unit. But the way they pulled off the Nurglings would be difficult to replicate with other types of swarms. Because remember, you have to make it where they can hit things in the game, and then things can hit them, and it doesn't look really weird. Which, if the swarm doesn't like make something large and vaguely man-shaped, it's difficult to make someone hit them and it not look really stupid. So, like, could you do it? Yes. Will they do it? I kind of doubt it, because it would require some pretty hefty development. But they could. I mean, they definitely could. Are Azrai probiotic bacteria? Kinda.
Sure, that's one way to make an analogy for them. And I'm pretty sure that anyone with any biological knowledge could come up with a variety of other options as well.
Sorry if you already touched on this or it's coming later, but how would you describe the daily normal lives of elves living in Athel Loren? We haven't, actually, and that's a great question. So it depends.
I think actually it might be worth, to a degree, tackling this as we move through the realms. Because the different realms have got quite different ways of living. And some of them have got very clear ways of living, and other realms are so vastly different that if we spend time answering this, we'll be in many respects not answering the realms.
That's a good point. So we will tackle that as part of the realm
discussion.
We'll
get through that in the end. So it's coming very soon.
We got 2 more suggestions, and then we're into it. What else could use the Japanese method of obtaining metal ores from sand deposits along the banks of rivers? Incredibly efficient, but no mine. Yeah, that's a great example. Excellent example.
Yeah, and when that's combined with magic and similar, suddenly you've got yourself a variety of different ways. Plus, you've got to realize that if we just take a look at all the Wood Elf models, metal is much less on their agenda than it is in comparison to the other elves that you see. They are covered with a variety of leathers and woods and lacquered items that are quite different to the tip-to-toe scale mails or the plate mails that you'll get with some of the dark elves. They're just working differently. They're often using their metals for different purposes.
Is there a particularly deep pool of water in the forest? Now the fishermen into the forest with their nightly fish rituals under the moonlight. You joke, but yes, the answer is yes.
No, there is.
Very bluntly, there are actually several pools that are specific. The Glade of Eternal Moonlight has some pretty notable giant pools in it. So let's talk about kingdoms.
I'm going to get there eventually.
Just to make it easy, we're just going to hit all 12 of them in order because it makes them relatively easy to discuss. So we're going to start with everybody's favorite, the basic bitch. The most neutral of them is Tolson. So Talsin, also known as the Groves of Eternity, ruled over by Erloth the Bold, is pretty much smack in the center. It basically comprises the lands around the Oak of Ages and the King's Glade, which is where all of the big bosses, the 15 ruling elves who are the ruling council of Athel Loren, meet up and discuss things and make decisions until Ariel inevitably gets mad and overrules all of them. Allegedly, they're the ruling body most of the time. What's interesting about Talsin in particular, so Talsin's it's a really neutral zone as far as like when you think Athel Loren, Talsin is what you're actually probably thinking of, in that it's the very stereotypical magical elven forest.
Yeah, Talsin is the heart of the Wood Elf Kingdom, and it is. If you want to get a quick comparison and go, well, what does this mean? Think of it like the Reichland of the Empire. It is the beating heart of the rest of the Wood Elf realms. It is arguably the most powerful, certainly got the most power held within it. It is the central connecting point for most of the world routes. It is a place where the local spirits are working in harmony with the Wood Elves rather than there being constant tension. There is tension, but it's a tension born of people working together and reaching compromise rather than a tension of people going to, for example, political conferences and saying the other guys all need to die, and then going to political conferences and the other side saying, oh, guys, and the other side are evil. It's not like that. They are working and making compromises at all points. It is ultimately the general Wood Elf realm. And it's the best way of thinking of this is, if you want to have a stereotype for the Wood Elves, this is where you come from, and this is where you really get an idea of the strongest back of the military as well, in some regard.
Yeah, and it's a very key balance between the spirits and the elves. Where here the spirits are relatively amicable because they genuinely try really hard to be amicable with the elves, and those are kind of the really, really important aspects of Talsin. Like, because a lot of it has to do with just dealing with one of my favorite quotes actually about Talsin, to put it into perspective how fucking nasty dryads are and that elves are not safe from them. There's a quote about Talsin that says that the dryads are not particularly friendly towards the elves, but they refrain from stealing elven children like they do in the other 11 kingdoms.
Which is, I think, worth noting, because the elves themselves steal children from the surrounding realms, and that's a part of Bretonnian lore too. So do be aware that there is a cycle here that is replicated on multiple fronts. But yes, elven children are stolen by dryads. It is not a fun place to live.
Yeah, no. You always have to be on guard. You always have to be on guard. Next, we get into one of the really fun realms, which is Aranok, the Summer Strand. So Athel Loren, you can vaguely split up the 12 kingdoms in that there are 4 of them that are dedicated, one to each season. There are 2 of them that are denoted to time, being specific times of day. And then there's kind of like a handful of others that have to do with more like terrain types or specific concepts. So this is the first one that's dedicated to a season, being the Summer Lands. And this land is simultaneously, you would think, you're like, oh, summer, okay, that's nice. And you're like, yeah, it's got great parties, banquets, they live in plenty. It's also, in many ways, one of the most terrifying fucking places in Athel Loren. Because this is a land of deception, despite the summerness. It is a land where they invite guests. If you wander into it, you'll think you're coming into the greatest party of all time. They'll welcome you, whether you're human.
The party realm.
Yeah, humans, ogres, halflings, even maybe dwarfs have been welcomed here, and they're brought to banquets, and they eat, and they're treated as honored guests, very respectful, and they're allowed to feast to their heart's content. But it's a trap, because the Summerland has a terrible secret. It's not really a secret, but it has a terrible
secret.
Yeah, it has a terrible flaw, which there is a particular location called the Vaults of Winter. And the Vault of Winter are one of 2 places in Athel Loren that are horrifically dangerous, because the Vaults of Winter it's a big cave that goes into this set of mountains that It's not explicitly clear how exactly this works, but it essentially seems to connect into the realm of chaos.
Nah, I wouldn't say that. It definitely doesn't say the realm of chaos. It connects directly to a civilization, or something that was built by a civilization that is older than the elves and arguably the forest.
Or phrase of that, it has a bad habit of pouring out demons of Slaanesh.
Indeed. And I don't think it even says they're a demon of Slaanesh.
They are.
It's a demon of Slaanesh?
Yeah, well, so okay, what I'm gonna add here. This is one of those circumstances where I think the writer, if they were not talking about the battle game, it would be a very unique, bizarre type of creatures that come out of it. But because they're working within the restrictions of the battle game, they need to identify the creatures that are coming out, and so they make them demons of Slaanesh. Because this is the land ruled over by Amadri Ironbark, and his whole thing is he gets killed by a bunch of demons of Slaanesh that come out of the Vaults of Winter.
Yeah, so I thought that was come the end times though.
No. Because he's Ironbark.
There you go. I didn't even recall that. So I find this one really funny because I actually hate this description. And I'll tell you why. It tells you fuck all about Aranok. All it tells you is about a big party with people that get invited to party and then sacrificed by the dryads down to this ancient cave to keep this ancient evil at bay, which I still don't think necessarily is Slaanesh. It tells you nothing about the kingdom, other than, interestingly, the folks from it are like normal elves. And by that I mean, they are not isolationist in general, not just because of this great ritual they do, but they are willing to work with and accept other species in the things that they do, which means that if you're sitting there out there going, well, you know what I really could do with as a player in my game, and Azrai, coming from Aranok is a perfect example of someone that would work well with almost any party. The Summer Strand offers PCs basically for your games out there. It is, I think, an area that is vastly underserved in the lore as it stands, and one that is just waiting to be written in a far deeper and more interesting way, because this is the doorway into Athel Loren. This is a clear route in from the outside, and if you're looking to write something for it, this is where you could start and get a really good story that makes sense for moving into the area.
So there are two really interesting things about Aranok itself. So just ignoring the Vaults of Winter, which I'll talk about just a smidge about in a moment, which is that Aranok, from the description of it, of like, oh, it's very friendly to outsiders, like they're very friendly elves, like not even from a duplicitous standpoint, they're genuinely very friendly. And the spirits there are in constant bounty. Like the spirits there are vibrant at all times. Because they're in glorious summer. And the thing that's interesting is that from the description of it, you would think it would be one of the outer kingdoms in the sense that it would be on like the edge with Bretonnia, but it's not. It's actually on the edge of the Grey Mountains. So it's the northeasternmost kingdom, which opens up a lot of really interesting thoughts about like the kinds of people that tend to wind up there, being people that are either crossing over the mountains or they go into Athel Loren. The forest itself leads them there to buy.
There's also a path through there. And if you don't know, there's a pass that goes from Blood Pass over in Visenland all the way across the north there and through directly into Paravon. So there's an actual road that's a trade road that goes through there and sadly goes right beside blood-stoked Vampire Central over in Visenland, which not necessarily great, but yeah, there's definitely a route that you could get in there, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah, the funny thing is that in the modern lore, the Vaults of Winter, if you were playing a Wolfric campaign, are actually currently, so pre-end times, not as big of an issue because they're currently sealed. Because the Lord of Aranok is a guy by the name of Amadri Ironbark, who used to be a Maldry Dawnspear, who was this cool elf, but when a bunch of demons came cavorting out of the Vaults of Winter, which once again, like Andy said, we don't know who built the Vaults of Winter. It was not built by like demons or chaos worshippers. It's an ancient civilization that's unnamed, that's in the mountains. So it's like, it's part of the Grey Mountains, but right on that border of Athel Loren. So it's also kind of part of Athel Loren. But some ancient civilization built down there, and whatever they did, there's like a rift into the realm of chaos or something that opened up. Who knows? Something happened, and demons of Slaanesh
I find that one very interesting. That it's because I hadn't seen the bit. Where is it that they say that it's Slaanesh? Because I had literally had a discussion with someone
you
that
have
was
to go.
involved
You have
in
to go
doing
into
it.
the timeline section, and what happens is,
Which have I just is it in the is it edition book? I missed that entirely. That's really annoying.
It's just it's one of the timeline seconds because it talks about how Amadri becomes a treekin because he's not an elf, he's a treekin.
Yeah.
He gets ripped apart by Slanesh demons and tortured. He dies, takes over a dead tree as a treekin, and he climbs the mountains, and he causes an avalanche which crushes all the demons and seals the Vault of Winter, which stays sealed until the end times when Be'lakor blows the entrance up.
Opening up. That I remembered. Yeah.
So
interesting.
Interesting.
Particularly given how it's described. I don't have the book here. I've got it over here. Because I remember that they literally describe as the things that are down there are as very Slanesh sounding, but not actually as Slaneshi creatures. And they're looking to feast upon entities that are glutted. And I found one of the descriptions there super fun for potential roleplay as well, because some of the people that arrive, those that are outsiders who come to the place, regardless of species, they basically party out until they're completely glutted on sensation of some sort.
No. It's way more interesting than I thought. Wait, it's more interesting than I thought. I just looked it up.
Yeah.
So it's not that there's a portal. So what it specifically says is, it's on page 28, but it says horror from the vaults.
I'm gonna get
the winds of magic blow particularly strong through the vaults of winter, rousing to life demons that have been frozen in its enchanted caves. So there's an army. So there's an army of Slanesh demons that got frozen down there.
Frozen, you say?
Yeah,
nice,
fascinating.
Good. Okay, so no, that I like.
That's a lot more interesting than I initially thought it was. Cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. Particularly because it's frozen as well. That just appeals.
That explains why it's called the Vaults of Winter. Aha.
Yeah, absolutely. Much prefer that. But yeah, the little detail I was going to say that there are outsiders who have bided their time partying out for centuries in this particular part of Athel Loren, which means that there are humans, there are potentially dwarves, there's potentially a bunch of folk who have been living hand in hand with the Wood Elves for not decades, centuries, until eventually reach the point where they become so saturated they can then be offered as a sacrifice by the Dryads down to that particular nasty place to the south of Aranok. And that is, in terms of an interesting location, just fascinating, because you can have all sorts of people from all sorts of times all meeting in this location. It just sounds super fun.
Well, and what I really like about that is that implies that it's almost like there is a winter god or something that keeps winter from the eternal summer of Aranok that has to be sated to be kept down there. And it's such a genuine winter spirit that even demons just get frozen solid getting anywhere near it.
Yeah, it could definitely be that.
Yeah.
I already have in my head a different tale, but yeah, that'll do.
My favorite canonical character that has participated in the Feast at Aranok is, because a lot of people, you may think, oh, okay, so it's just a death trap. No, a lot of people are welcomed in and they leave after they party. My favorite being the ogre tyrant Rockjaw, who him and his tribe come over the Grey Mountains into Aranok, and they get invited to a feast and they have a great time. They eat, and then they all kind of drowse off because Dream Wine is an export of Aranok, which Dream Wine is intense shit. And he kind of just wakes up and finds like a big Skaven army, and him and his ogres just obliterate the Skaven. And the elves come to him and are like, hey, here's all the money we agreed to give you for wiping out the Skaven army, which he remembers none of this discussion. And Rockjaw's, you'd think an ogre would be like, oh, this is great. I got to eat. I got paid. I got to fight. He looks at it and takes it. And he goes, we are never going into that forest ever again. We are leaving. We are never coming back to this place, which is just super funny.
The whole idea of this realm is so contrary to how the Azrai are described in almost every other place that it is exceedingly noteworthy, because they make for great potential characters to use and bridge into some of the other factions throughout the old world. So I think there is a massive potential for what is effectively the Summerlands of the Wood Elves for just being a useful way to bridge into Athel Loren if you are running any games out there.
Yep. Next we have, and also, its ruling council member, its ruling leader is a treekin, which is fucking fascinating.
Agreed.
But we don't have time to really dive into that. Arguelin, the Moonspring Glades. So now you may hear Moonspring go, oh, it's the Night Realm. No. This is the Water Realm. It is a realm dominated by naiads and water spirits.
Love it.
It's also a very magical realm. Magic is redolent here, which makes sense because Gairan is drawn to bodies of water very often. It's now my favorite note about this is apparently the elves of Arguelin are insufferable. Everybody, they're not jerks. They're know-it-alls, is kind of the way it implies, because they keep the history of Athel Loren. They're big on keeping written records, recording history, knowing a lot of things. And apparently, everyone else, they're so arrogant that other elves of Athel Loren do not like talking to them.
Yeah, I think this whole aspect is really quite fascinating because the Wood Elves, particularly as you move through the 4th edition into the 6th edition, they change from the elves that they were originally, and they move from using records and recording everything and using books or any equivalent, and they instead move to the scalds and spoken word and the dance of the war dances. And the war dancers in particular, and the Loic himself, the god of the war dancers and the god of trickery also, is the great repository of knowledge for the Wood Elves because their dances speak truth. And their dances speak truth to all of the elves. So they record their stories through movement and through dance and through song, where the good old Arguelian elves, they are scholars.
We're going to run it down.
They are scholars. They're almost certainly tied to Hoeth. It's never mentioned explicitly that I'm aware of, but they're almost certainly tied to Hoeth, which in and of itself is a very Kadai version of it, as in the heavenly host of elven gods, which means that they are in their nature far closer to high elves in terms of where they sit with how they handle knowledge, how they use knowledge. And this is effectively their equivalent of the Great White Tower of Safri, but interestingly, not necessarily tied through to the greatest mages in all the realms, because they're not here necessarily using the weave in the same way that everyone else is, because they're
true. Though it is described as the realm
very magical. Yeah, totally.
Magic.
And I think that speaks to the type of elves that they are. Again, as is often the case with the newest update, because they have so little space to tell the stories that they're telling, all we really get is one single stereotype. This is a people that work like this. So instead, everybody hates them because they are the proudest of wood elves, which I think is hilarious and also a bit silly, but also really good to as a starting point for characterizing.
So there are two notes about them that are really interesting, which is that because of the way they apparently talk, they're considered very insufferable by other Azrai, but the Naiads like them, though there is a hilarious note that the Naiads are apparently very infamous for being unchoosy in the company they keep, which is, to me, feels like propaganda. But the thing I find interesting that tells a different story is that the Great Eagles love them, because they're the only of the Azrai who truly remember how to speak the ancient language of the Eagles fluently, whereas the rest of the Azrai have forgotten.
I love that. I particularly love it as well because there's a whole bunch of side stories about the High Elves and their ability to communicate with the Griffins, with the Great Eagles, and everything else, because they've held on to that knowledge very clearly. And here we have ourselves an example of the differences between the Azrai and the Azur, where the elves from Ulthuan have retained the knowledge to speak and communicate with all of the great beasts, where the Wood Elves don't. And that's fascinating because you would expect the Wood Elves to be the ones to be able to do that, because that's the standard stereotype. The standard stereotype is, oh, they're more at one with nature, ain't they? That means they're the ones that can speak to the animals, right? Well, no, because it requires a certain level of study and intellect and knowledge that the Wood Elves have lost to time in general, except for some of them, obviously, that we have here. Where the High Elves, it's a part of their standard extended lore. So we get some very clear differences that are not standard for classic fantasy tropes. In the classic fantasy trope, all of our Wood Elves would be chatting away like mad with their spiritual animals that they're riding. But we get the opposite here, where the vast majority of them are working with them and perhaps using spells to kind of communicate and at least get things across, but they're not speaking with them, where the High Elves are. And these particular Wood Elves are. And I think that's really nice. And it's a detail. I remember the first time I read it, I was like, that's brave. It's an actual brave piece of writing because they're going against the standard stereotypes.
I think the fascinating thing for me is that between the fact that they keep a written history, they seem to build actual structures, because there's this mention of the Waterfall Palace which is the court of the Naiads, where they treat with the Naiads, and they built this building that has these waterfalls that whisper to those that are nearby. And that they have this big relationship with the Naiads, but not the Dryads and the other forest spirits. They do not have that same relationship with the forest spirits that they do with the water spirits. And they have held on to ancient languages. To me, it really smacks of that these are elves that have held very strongly onto actual elven traditions. So not like high elven per se, but elven tradition.
Totally.
And that makes the other Azrae not like them as much, because they haven't properly integrated from what a lot of the Azrae. So it makes sense why they wouldn't be liked, which is really interesting.
And I think from the perspective of those who are writing this place and trying to add extra detail, you've got a very, very clean direction. For all we didn't get an awful lot of detail written inside the book, it's very obvious that what we have here is a bastion of elven community, as in old school elves. So the elves that migrated into this area, the Kith bands and whatever, are elves who have very much held on to many of their older traditions that they had from when they came from Ulthuan, where the elves around them have not held on to those. And because they've not held on to those and they've integrated with the forest more deeply, they look at them and they're like, yeah, no, you're doing it wrong. And they are sitting separate going, yeah, no, you've lost what it is to be an elf. You're doing it wrong. We are better than you. And you immediately get the reasons for why there is a social conflict between the pair of them, because there is very real conflicts in core beliefs as to how they express themselves. And I think that a lot is hinted at with those couple of paragraphs, while simultaneously, I really wish we got much more. So I think there is a lot that could be run with there. And again, they make potentially a very good route for those of you out there who are thinking, how can I use Athel Loren at all in any game? Aren't they all isolationist weirdos who would never touch anyone? No, we've got ones here who would almost certainly work with, under the correct circumstances. They are wood elves after all, but under the correct circumstances, they'll be working with the Azure. They will see lots of potential similarities between their way of life and the old way of life. In fact, I would argue they're probably almost indistinguishable from many that come from Avalorn, because the Avalorn effectively are the wood elves of Ulthuan.
Interestingly, it's like, I think that these are elves that Azrae that like would not be unusual to come across in like a city like Marienburg. And you'd be like, oh, this guy's like a really weird like high elf. It's like, oh no, he's actually from Athel Loren. He's just weird. Next up we have Modron, the Night Glens. So this is the Night Realm. Now what's interesting is that it's said that it wasn't always like it is now, where it used to be a realm of starlight, but now it is only a realm of darkness, where the only source of light are the spirits that live in it, being these little spites and other creatures that give off light. And it talks about how before Ariel, which if you go watch our Durthu stream, we talk about this, there's a time in Ariel's life where she went heavy into dark magic, really heavy into dark magic. She went a little too far, one might say. And Ariel eventually brought herself back into balance, though it cost Audinhu his life, which was a pretty nasty cost. The Night Glens represent that part of Athel Loren's history, where as darkness, in a very like metaphysical sense, kind of started taking over Athel Loren, the Night Glens lost its starlight, and it never got it back. So it's instead of being a realm of night, in the sense of like genuine night, so like you're outside in a field and there's stars and all that and the moons and all that, instead it has become a realm of gloom, is a better way to put it.
Yeah, let's be blunt. It's a realm of Dar. Dar has settled into the place. So Dar is the dark magic of Worm, the black magic of Warhammer, the combination of all the winds into something that is particularly quite corrosive and destructive. But because the very nature of the forest itself is stronger than the magic that permeated through it, it's instead been influenced rather than directly corrupted by it. But interestingly, the elves here are different to the elves elsewhere, because the elves here are deep into the darker side of the good old elven pantheon. They're far more interested in the Canes and the Earth-Kails and Mathlands et al. Than they are with the far more, let's say, in-betweeny gods or the Karai gods. So again, we've got ourselves a perfect realm here if you're looking to bridge into different civilizations around the Warhammer world, because there are many elves here who would not just be sympathetic with, they would have very many similarities with dark elves. They've got a similar pantheon that lies at the center of what they consider to be a good way of living. They've got a way of thinking that is far more dark elf than it is wood elf, than it is arguably, definitely, than it is high elf. So we've got ourselves another bridge into the outside world. So again, chipping away at the Azrai don't make good PCs for your games, player characters, they absolutely can. And they absolutely can work with other types of elves. This is where you could build yourself a group of Azrai and Dark Elves, and it would work well, very well, because they're worshipping the same gods. They just have different cultural sensitivities and sensibilities. And these different cultures will lie at the conflicts that your group would have, and that would be super fun to play through. So this is where Wood Elves work well with Dark Elves, unlike the last lot where the Wood Elves work well with High Elves, or the ones before where the Wood Elves work well with anyone. So there's lots of routes into Athel Loren. And again, we know what the stereotype is of the Azrai. The Azrai themselves are all of that. They are the worst. They are xenophobic and isolationist and alienist. They do not like others. But there are lots of individuals who stand quite contrary to that.
Yep. And it's also, Modern is where you're going to find your dark magic users, like your masters of dark magic from the Azrai perspective. And
that comes hand in hand with Hecate worship and all the rest, which although if you go over to the Dark Elf farm, you'll see, if you go over to Hecate, you'll see there's only really one shrine to Hecate. It's in Grand or whatever. Yeah. The truth is that if you're going to find shrines to Hecate here as well, and they're going to manifest in far more wood elven ways than you would, for example, find over in Sacrifice Center that is Nagaroth.
Yeah, and what's actually really interesting is despite it actually, Modron in this sense makes a really good defensive kingdom as well for Athel Loren, because it's one of the outer kingdoms that borders Bretonnia. Because if you go in there, you cannot fucking see. There is no light other than the spikes. Like, there's no stars, there's no moons, there's no any of that. Which
terrifying
honestly,
place to visit.
Yeah, terrifying. But also
terrifying. Exactly with the spirits living there. Oh, and think how many of them will be. It's easy to say corrupted by Dar because that's generally the language they use. But we're looking at the more dark aspect of the local spirit.
By Dar.
They are gonna be some pretty bleak, grim individuals. It's gonna be
capricious and malicious. Yeah. Though, I'll say, I think there's an interesting story that could be told for Modron about how Morcelib's light does not reach this land, which could tell for an interesting story about how chaos could actually struggle to influence in some ways.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the best things to think about when you're looking at trying to adapt these things to games or stories. Every time that you get yourself a new rule, the rule here of this place is that the astronomical, what lies beyond, does not influence what's down below. Suddenly, many things become weaker, and Morrslieb is one of those things. The influence of Morrslieb is really unknown here, meaning that the study of dark magic will both be more difficult because you won't be able to draw upon the definite Morrslieb's light brings Dar you can use in a variety of ways, but it'll also be safer because it's much easier to modulate. It won't be influenced by external forces to the same degree. And that's cool because it gives you a place where you can study dark magic in the Wood Elf realms in a place that's potentially much safer than almost anywhere else, arguably in the Warhammer world, which is super cool.
Yep. Next, we have Kavarok, the Skymark Reaches, which is actually really interesting because it's not actually a forest. It's plains. So it does have, it is part of Athel Loren. It is part of, quote unquote, the forest. But once again, like we talked about earlier, where not all of Athel Loren is like traditional trees. This is a place where other forms of plant life excel. And these are the horse lands, where all of the horse riders, the great and mighty horse riders of Athel Loren come from. And it's a land of adrenaline and speed and brash action. These are the guys that like to sign up for the wild hunt instantly whenever it comes cavorting through. And they go to war a lot. They have to deal with a lot of Bretonians because for invaders of Athel Loren, it is the safest kingdom to attack because it doesn't have all the angry trees everywhere. It has its own forms of defenses, but it's a really interesting realm because it really spits in the face of what you would expect when you think Athel Loren, and that it's these weaving plains of grass, which is really fascinating.
And so it's not tree free. Let's be
it's not
clear as you can be. It's not entirely devoid. They obviously have not just copses and small forests. All of that exists there. It is a place of glades and trees and open plains. And it does stand contrary to what most people expect for their elves. And again, to reinforce what Sotek there, this is the first part of Athel Loren that tends to receive conquest from Bretonnia every time because it is obvious land that they can move into. And the elves of the local area kind of revel in that shit because they are exceedingly warlike in return, and indeed as likely to turn around and invade upon any sign of any army being in the local area as they are to try and just simply fight them. This is where we gain our warlike PCs. This is where we gain our generals and our soldiers and our ones that just like to kill things. They are horse masters pretty much to a man, and they are super cool because of that, because it provides a very different tale in terms of the background that you will get here in comparison to any other part of Athel Loren. We're not talking about the spooky trees and the spirits, although this place still has its trees and its spirits. It's just that's not the core components of their existence as it is everywhere else in Athel Loren.
Yeah, it's it comes off much more of a land dominated by the beasts that wander the plains, as opposed to the more traditional forest spirits, which is just really fun. So then we have Athelwith, the Winter Heart, which, if it's not obvious, is the realm that is in perpetual winter. It never leaves winter. This place I love this place. It's super fascinating because it is, of the places that are occupied by the elves, it is a prison for spirits that are truly foul. Because what the elves will do here is that they have all these sculptures that if you were to visit Athelwith and you're approaching their winter palaces, which are carved and sculpted from ice, they have all these statues everywhere that are sculpted from ice. And if you look at them, but you look away and look back at them, sometimes they change or they look like they're watching you. And it's because they literally are. They are spirits that the elves capture and they contain them within ice so that they cannot wreak havoc somewhere else in Athel Loren, which is really cool.
What I particularly like about that Wadi, is that because they don't have spirits at all, and they are not, for example, blessed with all the great beasts of the plain like Kavarok, they are arguably the hardest. They are the most capable at war. They have an almost obsession with their own martial capabilities, which stands in comparison to what you might necessarily expect from this group that are imprisoning and holding other horrible spirits, including some of their own people at some point. Their icy halls are so very, very focused on martial capability, which is, I think, another fun aspect of what it is to live in this particular realm, where each of the realms, for all that they're given some very broad-based brushstrokes, this one actually has several brushstrokes all at once, because we have them combating, holding, imprisoning, and then we have the strong warlike, because they don't have any way of holding off the denizens of the forest other than doing it themselves. They can't call upon allies. They can't bring in anybody else other than themselves. So that adds, I think, a really interesting realm character for them.
Yeah, and they have the least spirits because the spirits there sleep. The spirits there, they don't wake up all the time. It's no, they sleep often for centuries at a time or never wake up.
And it's their job to protect them too.
Yeah. So these elves, it is the elf kingdom. So like if you're like, I want an elf that has very little experience with spirits and like he's more very material oriented, he's gonna be from the Winterheart. Next we have the really spooky one, Sithril the Wildwood. Sithril is literally, it's literally just it's a big old prison. That's all it is. It is the most horrifying place in all of Athel Loren, where, like I said, if you go in there, the best case scenario is that you get eaten out of your skin and your skin gets worn outside. And this one of the really fun things, 8th edition really had fun with this because this gave us the Wildwood Rangers, the elves with the big old two-handed glaives. Their job is to make sure nothing goes in and nothing comes out.
The danger of and it's not just the enormous horrors that live in there, of which there are many enormous horrors. It's the fact that some of the most malicious, malign entities exist in there, some of which are just quite typical in terms of your old fairy tales, shapeshifters and like peacocks dropping their eggs off in someone else's. They're quite literal changelings, where they will try to become someone else. They'll try to take over kingdoms. The elves here are pretty much protecting the rest of the world from absolute horror, because the spirits in here ain't happy. They are really unhappy. They are at the darkest expression of everything that Athel Loren has suffered through over its many thousands of years of existence, including the very worst depths of the Cataclysm. You could argue that many of the greater entities in here are the very things that help protect Athel Loren all those thousands of years ago.
Trapped here.
It's a classic example of what do soldiers do when the war comes to an end. It's a lovely little metaphor that pops up in more movies than you care to mention, with the whole, what does the soldier do next? Because I don't fit in anywhere and I'm a trained killer. All I do is kill. I'm designed to infiltrate and murder everything. And the elves, it's their job to stop those fuckers getting out. One of the crimes, you could argue, of the end times is not using something like this to its maximum. Because this is somewhere where we should have had a triumphant release. The great unstoppering of the Wildwood and the horror that it would inflict upon what was appearing to be, up to that point, triumphant Chaos troops. And this should be the worst of the freaking worst. There's things trapped in here that have slain greater demons as if they were nothing. And that is what is being held back by the elves, because they know if one gets out, they are going to be indiscriminate. They're not going to be going, I'm off to try and find a bad guy now. No, they are going to work according to their quite animalistic urges, because they're not creatures that you can reason with. These are entities of pure purpose, and that's it. And their purpose is to seduce, to corrupt, to destroy, to just murder and maim. Super cool place. And it also gives you a really cool place for an elf to come from, because we've got ourselves really top tier weird elves used to dealing with the very worst magical entities that the world can offer. And interestingly, they're also investigators and hunters. They move through Athel Loren, tracing the ones that get away, because some of them, because they're small, can get away and they can cause untold havoc in the other realms. So they're ones that will be seen throughout the realms of Athel Loren, which again makes for potentially some super cool stories.
Yeah, one of the things that's really, really interesting is that there's an additional set of waystones just around the Wildwood as like an extra layer of protection to keep these things in there. But like Andy said, a lot of the time things will get out. And there's some neat little tidbit stories that are just express how horrifying being essentially a guardian or a police state that has to keep these spirits in. The Wildwood Rangers have really strict tenets of things like, if a Wildwood Ranger crosses that border or is standing by it, and like they have like a really strict buddy system, right? Where you travel in groups and you keep eyes on each other. If one of them gets isolated for too long and the other Wildwood Rangers find him, they will without question decapitate him, because they can't risk it. Like he might not be infected, but they can't be sure. So they kill them and then get their bodies back into the Wildwood, because it's that fucking dangerous. You cannot take any risks. Which, like Andy said, Wildwood Rangers would make hell awesome PCs, because they're expert spirit hunters, or essentially demon hunters. They're the witch hunters of Athel Loren. Essentially.
And they're super cool. And unlike witch hunters of, say, for example, the Empire or equivalent, they're not chasing down their own people who have gone bad. They're chasing down the bad that are chasing their own people, which makes them super, super different and also super fun.
Yeah, if you're playing the enemy within, you're like, man, I want to play a character that just fucking hates Gideon and is designed to shit on Gideon, a Wildwood Ranger is the ideal character for that.
Defo.
Tersith, the Ashen Hall. So this is the Autumn Realm, dedicated to that season. And it's a bummer. It is a land of mournful dirges and sorrow, because it's a land where death is always beside them, where everything is in decline perpetually. What's interesting is that the elves that live here come off very much kind of like the Phoenix Guard, where they're not depressed. They have a very stoic and accepting relationship with the end of things, as opposed to like being very sad. Like, they deal with a lot of death, they deal with mourning, they deal with celebrating those who have been lost, but they're not depressed, which is a really interesting flip on what you might expect from them.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that unexpected. It's a classic piece of viewing death as just a part of the natural cycle. And their general perspective is acceptance rather than denial. The classic mortal route towards death is to fear and deny, to pretend it's not going to happen, to ignore, where they're far more at one with it. And as I recall, makes relatively clear, it's not that they're more fatalistic. They're not more everything's going to go wrong and we're all going to die. It's just that they accept it. They're not necessarily dour. They're not down. They are much more at one with themselves than many others, and in some respects far happier because of that, where other elves may view it in a very different way. The kin bands that work around here accept death as a part of their existence. And that, again, speaks to, in the slightly broader picture, clearly shrines to Morai Heg are going to be a core component.
One of the things I actually find really interesting about them that talks about is that essentially it's kind of like a big... The realm itself almost paints a picture of a mausoleum where they build like moonstone statues to all these different elven heroes, and they respect the dead. That the sentence that I find really interesting is that they like celebrate and remember the departed, even if the forest doesn't, which is really interesting. And that the forest spirits hang around these shrines. They're drawn to these shrines. Of that, if you were ever in the Ashen Hall, it would kind of be like walking into a giant, not a graveyard, but like, it's interesting because when you're dealing with like the High Elves and the Dark Elves, they don't tend to have like big places dedicated to the dead that get talked about a lot. Whereas for the Wood Elves, it's an entire fucking kingdom. Yeah,
it is. And I like this place. Again, it's painted a little bit single note for my preference. In that you like to feel that there's a bit more of a society going on here rather than just the worship of death being the core component of who they are. But it does sort of suggest there's a lot more going on there, particularly if you go back to earlier when you look at, say, the Ashen Glade in the previous editions. There's extra details that we can glean and pull upon and hopefully work in to build a better, slightly broader society here. I, however, really like this section. It gives us a different version of autumn where you often use winter to be the point of death, the point of darkness or some equivalent, where they're saying, no, the decline towards death is as much a part of it as the death itself. It's not just the death. This is very much the autumn, the fall, as we move towards it. And that's pretty cool. It's all in all a really interesting place, but do remember that these are wood elves. They're also dealing with their various incursions. They're also dealing with whatever else the elvish spirits and all the rest that they're dealing with. So their society is much broader than just somber. There is much more going on there.
Yeah. But it's interesting. It's like it's a place of memory, but in a very personal sense, as opposed to like a historical sense with the Night Glen elves, which is really interesting. Next up, we have Witcherioth, the Pine Crags.
Or Wydrioth, as I prefer.
Yeah. I love this place. The Sisters of Twilight are very heavily associated with this place because it is a veritable fortress. Basically, the entire kingdom. These elves get attacked by greenskins a lot, so they decided, all right, fine, and basically turned their kingdom into like a wall that is a bunch of super hardcore trees that are called sky crown trees or sky crown oaks that have their roots interwoven with rock and briar, and it looks like a
and
giant
Rockbriar. It's called Rockbriar, as I recall.
Oh yeah, and it's just a fortress that's meant to stand against the Boughs of the Greenskins. Yeah. And the people that live there, a lot of hawk riders. It is the place of hawks, not the eagles. Interestingly, the hawks, which are not as intellectual as the great eagles. And these people love to fight. They fucking love it. Because they
I
particularly
like this region. I love this region, in fact, because there's both the story it's telling and the story that it's not telling but is also telling. So there's more details here than you might initially expect. You've got the obvious. This is where we have our eternal war wood elves. This is where we've got ourselves our fast-striking, bloodthirsty,
our 40K
very Kane and Eldrazor focused elves. This is where we've got our fighters and our generals. This is also, however, where we've got our equivalent of engineers, our spell singers, who are wending these great routes together into the immense fortifications that extend for not just 5 or 6 or 20 miles, they extend for hundreds of miles along the edge of the Grey Mountains. And all of the various dwarves and orc and whatever else might be lying up there, incursions that make their way down there, are broadly speaking fucked. And that's great, because we get ourselves a people who are used to the warfare. The warfare happens, so don't think this is a place that, because it's so well defended, never gets attacked. It's actually the opposite. It's a place where orcs are frequently making forays into, that beastmen are making forays into, and they are not always held off. Try not to fall into the trap of reading a piece of background and going, well, that's entirely defensible. It'll never fall. Nonsense. Everything falls in Warhammer. These places are being infiltrated and broken into all the time. But the elves are used to this, ballooning back, getting around them, swooping back in again, swooping in on their hawks, the old swooping hawk, popping up again. So we're going to get ourselves a really interesting group of people who are both the fighters, the wizards, and the thinkers, all working together in a state of perpetual war. This is also somewhere that, because of the nature of what it is, if you've got yourself particularly bloodthirsty elves from elsewhere, many of them will have arrived here during the worst incursions as the call comes out across the wood, and some of them will have stayed, because that's just the nature of people. So there's going to be potentially a little bit more than you might expect mixture of cultures and kin bands over here. So there's potentially going to have unique individual units who have decided to stay to hold this particular part of a fortress, which from the outside just looks like a bunch of giant frickin' oaks. It's a super cool place. So yeah, I really like this one.
Yeah, it's also another thing I really like is it's a land of mazes. Because it's designed to make armies double back on themselves or get split up
and get lost. Yeah, totally.
Around. Which is just really fun. It's not just like, oh, it's like a big wall. It's like, no, it's way more complicated than that. And like parts of it go underground or overground, and it's a really fun place to think about. Then we have what I think is genuinely the land that gets the least explanation, but also allows for the most fun to think about, which is Firdarik, which is the Trickster's Wood. And this is the land of the war dancers. And it is a weird fucking place. This is Loic's land, Loic's kingdom. Also, super nomadic. Like there's no true settlements here. There's a great hall where the war dancers will gather for specific occasions, but it's
yes.
But it is the thing that's really interesting about it. I think my favorite quote about it is that it is a land of laughter, but in order for there to be the joke, there must be a victim. Which is really fast. It's a realm where everyone's trying to get one over on someone else, because it's the eternal comedy in a sense of that. When you look at it, you go, oh, okay. And then you think about if it's going to go, oh, okay, this place is probably really nasty.
As a classic example of that, someone falls over and hurts themselves, everyone looks at them and laughs. That is the very nature of the humor. And yeah, Firdarik is, I think, a classic example of trying to make something a monolith in terms of its culture, which it sort of has. But is I think potentially an interesting place to draw characters from, although it really does suggest, yeah, most of them are going to be Loic aligned. Most of them are going to be sitting on the balance. So in many respects, a classic example of the war dance, not the war dance, pardon me, the wood elf, where it's not so much, there's not really a good or an evil. It's just nature and the balance of nature. And they respect the bad things happen. And one has to take joy out of life as and where you can. There is a far deeper set of messages going on there, which I think is fun. They don't necessarily make for the most obvious PCs, although if you do look into the broader look of how the Wood Elves are pitched, you get the idea that they are now massively expanding out from Athel Loren for the fear of the end times coming. So if you're playing near an end times version, there's literally nothing wrong with a War Dancer Trooper 2 coming from this place and moving its way through the old world and other places, which could be, again, super fun.
Yeah, so some other things that are not explicitly stated, but interesting to think about, of that, because this is the land of the War Dancers, that also kind of implies that this is kind of the cultural heart of Athel Loren, because the War Dancers are the storytellers. They are the ones that tell stories, not just to maintain history, but to maintain like ethics and morals, and to explain the gods and like all these really complex topics. It is like they are the cultural centerpiece of the Azrites, the War Dancers. And the other thing I find really interesting is it talks about this. There's also essentially gladiatorial arenas where War Dancers will bring in captives on the equinoxes. So spring, summer, fall, and winter equinoxes. They will bring captives and allow them to fight War Dancers. And if you win, you are set free, which of course, very rarely does someone win.
No, they don't win. No one wins. That's the whole point. You don't win. You get told you'll be set free, but what they're actually doing is they're trying to see exactly how many cuts that they can make on the various people they brought in before they die. And they consider it particularly upsetting that if they don't get at least 100 cuts in before they kill the poor sod that made the mistake of coming into War Dancer Central, they consider that to be pretty damn rubbish because, hey, that wasn't much sport, was it? It's horrific. Do not consider this to be the same as, say, Eldrazi, the great god of fighting and all the rest. No. They are the butt of a great joke. There is no way of getting out of this. You're going to die. It is horrific. And that's kind of cool.
Yep. From there, just because we got two left, we got Torgavon, the Forge of Starlight. And
nice.
Yes, this is the land of craftsmen, artisans, and smiths. And it's also where Vol's Anvil lies, because every elven kingdom has got to have a Vol's Anvil, or they're not real elven kingdoms. Everybody's got a Vol's Anvil. Now, this one is wild, because this one has actual Vol in it. He's there. He's the boss, Lord Daith, who, as we all know, is the literal incarnate avatar of Vol, the Smith God.
Yep.
Which is, he makes some pretty crazy shit.
Yep. No other way of putting it. Daith is here. This is Vol. This is Vol's mortal incarnation in the mortal realms. This is quite literally yet another example of possibly Kurnus and Isha, if you believe that they are what they claim they are, although they are very different in terms of how they appear in comparison to some of the other avatars. But this is an avatar of the gods. And he has, in his time, done everything from forging a fragment of the Sword of Cain into an entirely new weapon to quite literally leading an entire section, one of the 12 realms of the Wood Elves. He lives here. His forges are here. You've got all the copper colors that run along with that because of the great warmth and the heat that comes with it. It's very much an autumnal toned location. And this is where all the artisans are. This is where your artisan PC would probably come from if you were going for a standard stereotype. This is where you can literally have a character who has talked with a god. But do note that nobody really knows this. This is us talking about it in the outside of the world.
This is a really dedicated
in world. He doesn't sit there and say, hey, I'm Vol, by the way. Well, I'm not literally, but I'm sort of am. And I'm blind just like Vol, and I'm doing stuff just... None of that is the case. They just know he is truly ancient. They know that he is probably older than the arrival of the elves in the kingdoms here. Probably. And that's it. He just acts as one of them, leading them, doing his bit. This isn't one of those ones where if you're building a character, you go, well, I've met the Vol Avatar, and he and I are best friends, and I know all about it. Yeah, it's not like that. He's just an ancient elf, and unlike, very much unlike what is the case with Orion and Ariel, there's no great respect that comes with that, or an expectation of being worshipped as an entity or rulership because of what he is. He rules because he is the best person to rule in this particular area, unlike the others who are ruling because they are kind of effigies of gods themselves. He is quite different in that regard, but super cool as a place.
Yeah, it's funny. As far as the avatars go, he keeps everything kind of on the down low. Though at the same time, he doesn't if you pay attention to what he does. But the other thing that's really interesting about this realm that I really love is that the forest spirits here have such an interesting relationship because they find the warmth attractive. They find the fire, the warmth and the light it brings kind of addicting, though Vol is careful to keep them out of that they don't get burned. So there's this really interesting relationship between, because this is the one place in Athel Loren where there's true industry. There are, smiths and forges and all this stuff where they use fire and metal, but they're careful to not let the spirits get too curious about it, which is, I find kind of adorable.
I think it's also quite likely you'd have fire spites and the rest here as well.
Oh, yeah.
Actual spirits of that type there too. It is, I think, a really nice realm because it's one where those of you who've read everything, you know that there's a great deal more going on here than you might first go. But it's also one that is much more both wood elven in terms of how they approach their industry, but also for those who expect the wood elves to all be their arrow flinging tree huggers, not necessarily the same type. They're a far more martially inclined group too. There's a lot there that's pretty cool.
Yep. And then last and unfortunately least is Enmire, the Witherhold. And this realm, to be honest, is not controlled by the Wood Elves. This is the kingdom of the Beastmen, because Morgur laid his claim here, and to put it bluntly, when Morgur gets his hooks into something, he's the God Eater. If he gets you, it's game over. Like, the Witherhold is fascinating to me because it's from the Wood Elf perspective, it is a withered, poisoned, corrupted land that they are powerless to heal. Like, they're struggling just to keep it from spreading. And the Beastmen are the masters of this kingdom, not the elves.
I wouldn't put it quite so strongly. I think that's almost hyperbole, because it's an easy angle to take. And the elves still rule here. The problem is that they don't rule all of it. And the problem is that they are fighting a losing battle and they're beginning to lose traction. I wouldn't say that the Beastmen rule. They don't. The Beastmen rule parts of it. The Beastmen control parts, but at points, they'll lose control of those. They'll be driven back, and then they will push back as well. This is a place in conflict, and a conflict that the elves are beginning to lose. The Witherhold is not going to be held for probably that much longer because of the corruption that lies through to its heart. As I recall, its description makes it quite clear that it's going to require literal divine intervention to remove that corruption. And divine intervention, as we all know from the elven side, ain't happening anytime soon.
It literally follows that up with, it needs divine intervention, but the gods of the elves are weak, or weakened.
Yeah. And that doesn't really, bode well for it. Cut a long story short, this place is going to fall. And that is, in and of itself, a great story, because this is now a source of tragedy. If you want to have a very obvious tale of tragedy, your home's being destroyed by beastmen, the classic Empire story in many respects, this is where you have an obvious place to cite it. This is a place where the magic of Athel Loren is beginning to corrupt and fall apart. This is where the spirits are also beginning to corrupt. And this is also a place where we could unleash some truly horrific spirits on both the beastmen and the wood elves. It's not just the beastmen that are the problem, it's the trees themselves that are dying. And because the trees are dying, their spirits are dying, and they're going wild because of this. So we have all sorts of cool stories that we could tell here.
Yeah, one of the
other armies coming in.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about Witherhold is that it very explicitly talks about that Morgur's corruption is not static; it's actively spreading, which is nightmarish because, like Andy said, the one of the things the Wood Elves realized to their horror is that Morgur's Morgur mutates things around him, which is obviously bad for people. Like, it's bad. But for spirits, it is so much worse. Like, Morgur's influence, the blood of his that is literally working its way through the ground like a cancer, can make spirits go just absolutely fucking insane.
Yeah.
And they'll just attack anything around him because Morgur doesn't care. Like, Morgur is like a classic, almost Cthulhu-esque god that does not give a damn about anything. He doesn't care if the beastmen are dying, if the elves are dying, whatever. He does not care. It does not care. And this is his legacy, which is horrible. It's fucking horrible. Even by chaos.
The place is screwed, it's spiritually corrupted, and it's a corruption that's going to spread. This is basically the end times made manifest within the wood. And this is really, if you're telling the end times story, where the story should begin for Athel Loren, and the corruption that potentially spreads through the world roots because of it. There is a host of really cool end time story that can be told from this point onwards. And if you're looking to build your own versions of stories out there, this is a good place to start for that.
Yeah, which would inevitably involve Drycha, because this is her home.
Yeah,
her.
We all know how happy she is. We're gonna have to do a stream about that absolutely happy spirit at some point.
Oh yeah, she is surprisingly consequential. She gets funny of all of Athel Loren, she is probably the character that does the most outside of Athel Loren, which is not good for the rest of the world because she is bad news.
Yeah, she is.
We gotta get caught up on like super chats.
We can't stop until we've super chatted.
Yeah, and then we'll get out of here.
Well, I'd just like to say before as the super chats are being found, we have just skipped over our expected 3 hours. This was a great topic. I'd also like to say that not only was it a great topic, we've actually not covered tons of it. There's loads of locations we've barely hit upon or just haven't mentioned. So I would recommend, if you're out there wanting to know more, go take a check out, at the very least, the Wood Elf Army List. It's a good start. It'll give you a good grounding in it all because it's a good book.
Yep, and who knows? We'll probably at some point do a part 2 on Athel Loren at some point. But this was a good broad.
I think we got some pretty good broad brushstrokes out of this one. Yeah.
Yep. All right, Jonathan Scott. What happens if the Wood Elves call down fucking Helldiver shit?
Down, left, right.
Who knows? Who knows? Any special relationship between the Forest Dragons and Athel Loren? Yes. Oh, yeah. This actually goes into my crackpot theory, which I'm just going to throw in your face because I don't have time to really get into.
Okay, throw it.
Which I'm going to say that the Azrai and the Forest Dragons and everything in Athel Loren are basically Chaos Elves. They are a group of elves and creatures that have been infected and corrupted by the place that they live in to the point that it has fundamentally changed them. Including
the Chaos Elves per se.
What in the not Chaos Elves in the sense of like chaos, but like to me they're basically the equivalent of they're no longer true elves in the sense that Athel Loren has so much control over the Azrai that it states in the lore that the Azrai's population neither grows nor shrinks. It remains constant because Athel Loren owns them.
I think there's definitely something to that. They are part of a larger organism now. They are no longer simply the elves that they once were. Their acceptance into the forest and their acceptance into the ecosystem of that forest and their part that they play within it has made the Azrai quite different to the Dark Elves and the High Elves. I wouldn't say that they're in any way close to being a separate species. They can still interbreed, do all their stuff. But I would say that they are quite different to what they once were, and I'd agree with that.
Yeah, there's some. I also think that there's a big exploration you could do of why Orion and Ariel are so weird as avatars.
Because they are weird
compared to all the other god avatars.
Yeah, I think just stating that for a potential future stream is enough. Just simply note that Orion and Ariel are not like the other avatars. Now, in terms of where they came in Warhammer history, in many respects, they are almost the inspiration for what becomes other avatars, which is in and of itself interesting. But when you look at the elven avatars as a whole, they are a bit weird, and that is good, particularly when you look at, say, well, good old Everqueen.
Yeah. Or just
so that's a different story. That's a different story.
Just look over at Date. I mean,
yeah,
something weird's going on there.
There is something weird going on.
Phil, we all know the wild hunt tends to spill over to the outside world when there aren't many foes within the forest to slay. As we know, this is a fairly uncommon occurrence, which then begs the question, who are these outsiders and how many are there within the forest at any given time? How well long can they survive within it? A lot of beastmen. Beastmen are all over Athel Loren. Athel Loren is not nearly as purged of them as they like to advertise that they are, because the beastmen know, which once again is this whole thing about how Athel Loren is not truly like a sentient thing aware of what's going on within it, because the beastmen thrive in Athel Loren. They have beast paths that the elves don't know about and can't find, and that allow the beastmen to travel in massive war herds because they're an infection.
Yeah, totally. Just as the paths within Athel Loren are dangerous for the elves and obviously for the beastmen too, they know where to go. They also know where not to go, and the beastmen often go where not to go, and they have found new paths, meaning that there's lots of ways that an infection can find its way into the organism that is Athel Loren. And that includes things like wandering knights from Bretonia. That includes people from the Empire who may be making an incursion down there. That includes dwarves who may be doing whatever it is the dwarves are doing, or ogres who are, for their own reason, doing their own thing, or greenskins. We all know greenskins love a good scrap. It's a haunted wood, not their preferred place to go. But if there's a fight to have, there's going to be some greenskins that are going to give that a go, particularly if they're forest goblins. So, yeah, there's all sorts of stuff in Athel Loren, and don't make the mistake of thinking that it is this place that if you enter, the elves pepper you. It's just not how it works.
Yeah, and I would say that as far as like, what do the Wild Hunt deal with internally? The big three tend to be Skaven, Greenskins, and Beastmen.
Skaven, of course.
Skaven gnaw on the roots, burrow up, and cause all sorts of problems. And but like, you know, there will be like big giant ogre tribes that wander in. Sometimes a dwarf hold will attack. Like Athel Loren gets punched by a lot of people, so the wild hunt is usually busy. You can almost kind of think of the wild hunt as an immune response. But unfortunately, instead of being timed to deal with an invasion, it's timed based on the season of the outer world, which means it has extreme limitations, which is bad and a weakness, to be frank. Anthony, another episode a little late, but I made it. I vaguely remember Sotek and Tarmogon episodes added spot. Yeah, I'll do that today. I'll do that tonight. That should be easy to do tonight. I think they're up. I just need to make new. I have to make like new little pictures for them. Sig, love you guys. In all seriousness, how much do I need to pay Andy for his finished Middenheim map? Does he have an Altdorf map?
So one Middenheim map isn't finished. It's like halfway done. I was doing all the bits that I needed for my game, and we're still in Middenheim doing some stuff. It was some pretty crazy stuff just last Friday. Do I have an Altdorf one? Not even started it. And I do intend to do one. We've got a thread hiding away in Discord somewhere on the LAWhammer side for trying to find all the published locations that have been mentioned concerning Altdorf. Do feel free to go find that out. It has not been populated for some time, meaning that there's still tons to do there. And I don't really want to start that map until I've got most of that grounding work already in place. So cut a long story short, we're not there yet.
And last one, still loading. Prep for the Gelt stream or the Krim Gelto stream. Indeed. But yeah, we're way over time. So thank you all so much for joining. We hope you had fun.
Oh, you rock. That was amazing.
Yeah, we had a blast. We will see you next week over on the LAWhammer channel for Takala. No vote this week because it's already done. So yeah, actually, funny enough, going from what we were just talking about with Ariel and Orion to Takala is in itself a fun thing. Because man, honestly, she has a lot more in common with them than they do with the other avatars. But that's weird. Anyway, we're just gonna leave that can of worms on the ground and get out of here. So thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye.